Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Tonight I'm here with some of the most jaw-dropping, unbelievable stories straight from Reddit to help you unwind after a long day. Whether you're winding down before bed, building something incredible in Minecraft, or just need some background entertainment while you relax, you're in the perfect place. I've got a collection of stories tonight that will make you question whether some people actually think before they act, or if they just live in their own alternate reality where normal social boundaries don't exist. These are the kind of encounters that make you grateful for the ordinary, predictable people in your life. So grab your favorite snack, get comfortable, maybe start up that peaceful creative world, and let's dive into some stories that prove truth really is stranger than fiction. Fair warning though, some of these might leave you wondering how these people function in everyday society. Our first story comes from someone who discovered their neighbour had a very creative interpretation of how package delivery works. My neighbour tried to claim my Amazon packages as theirs, and the whole situation was absolutely insane. I live in a duplex where we share a front porch, so packages for both units usually get left in the same general area. Never been an issue before, since we just grab whatever has our name on it and move on with our lives. Last Tuesday, I was expecting a delivery of some new headphones I'd ordered for work. I got the notification that they'd been delivered around 2 p.m. while I was still at the office. When I got home around 6, I went to grab my package from the usual spot on the porch, but it wasn't there. I figured maybe the delivery driver had put it somewhere else, so I checked around the sides of the building, behind the potted plants, everywhere I could think of. Nothing. Then I noticed my neighbour Caleb was outside watering his plants, so I walked over to ask if he'd seen any packages delivered. "Oh yeah," he said casually. "I brought them inside since they were sitting out there for a while. Didn't want them to get stolen." I thanked him and asked if I could grab mine. That's when things got weird. "Actually," Caleb said, "I think those packages might be mine. I've been expecting some deliveries too." I explained that I was specifically looking for a package from Amazon with my name on it. Caleb nodded and said he'd check, then disappeared into his apartment. He came back a few minutes later, empty-handed. "Yes, sorry, but those are definitely my packages. I checked the names and everything." This didn't make sense to me because I had the tracking information showing my package had been delivered to our address. I pulled out my phone and showed him the delivery confirmation. Caleb looked at it and shrugged. "Tracking information gets mixed up all the time. Trust me, I know my own packages." I asked if I could just take a quick look at the packages to verify the names, since there might be some confusion. Caleb got defensive immediately. "I'm not going to let you go through my personal deliveries. That's pretty invasive, don't you think?" I tried to explain that I just wanted to check if one of them had my name on it, but he insisted that he'd already verified they were all his. He said he'd ordered multiple items recently, and these packages matched what he was expecting. The next day, I called Amazon customer service to report the missing package. They were helpful and offered to send a replacement, but I was still bothered by the whole situation. Something about Caleb's behaviour seemed off. That evening, I was taking out my trash when I happened to glance through Caleb's window. His blinds were partially open, and I could see several packages on his coffee table. One of them was clearly the box for my headphones. I could see the Amazon logo and even part of the product name through the clear plastic window on the packaging. I knocked on his door immediately. When he answered, I told him I could see my package inside his apartment and asked him to please return it. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. "Those are my packages." I pointed out that I could literally see the headphones I'd ordered sitting on his table. Caleb claimed he'd ordered the exact same headphones, which seemed like an incredible coincidence. "Look," he said, "I understand you're confused, but these packages all have my name on them. Maybe your package got delivered to the wrong address." I asked him to show me the shipping labels so we could clear this up once and for all. That's when he really started getting agitated. "I don't have to prove anything to you. These are my packages in my apartment. I'm not going to stand here and be accused of stealing." I told him I wasn't accusing him of stealing. I just wanted to see the labels to make sure there hadn't been a mix-up. Any reasonable person would understand that, right? The labels have my personal information on them, he said. I'm not comfortable showing them to someone I barely know. This was getting ridiculous. I suggested we call the police to help sort out the confusion. If the packages really were his, he shouldn't have any problem with that. Caleb's whole demeanour changed immediately. Fine, he said. Wait here. He went back inside and returned a few minutes later with one package. It was definitely my headphones, and my name and address were clearly visible on the shipping label. I guess there was some mix-up after all, he said, handing me the box like he was doing me a huge favour. I asked about the other packages I'd seen on his table, since I was expecting a second delivery that day. Caleb claimed those were definitely his and shut the door before I could say anything else. The whole interaction left me feeling really uncomfortable. It wasn't a mix-up or confusion. Caleb had deliberately taken my packages and then lied about it repeatedly, even when confronted with evidence. I started paying much closer attention to package deliveries after that. Over the next 2 weeks, I caught him doing the same thing twice more. Both times he'd bring packages inside for safekeeping and then claim they were his when I asked about them. The second time, I actually waited outside and watched the delivery driver drop off packages clearly addressed to me. I went to get them immediately, but Caleb had already snatched them up in the 30 seconds I'd gone inside to grab my keys. When I confronted him, he stuck to the same story about the packages being his, even though I'd literally watched them get delivered with my name on them. I finally had to get building management involved. They reviewed the situation and spoke with both of us. Caleb maintained that it was all a series of misunderstandings, but agreed to stop bringing in packages that weren't addressed to him. The property manager suggested we install a package locker system to avoid future issues, which seemed like a reasonable solution. But here's the thing that really bothered me about the whole situation. Caleb never once apologized or acknowledged that what he'd done was wrong. Even when caught red-handed with packages clearly addressed to me, he acted like he was the victim being unfairly accused. The final straw came when I got home from work last week and found Caleb opening one of my packages on the porch. Not just holding it or moving it somewhere safe, but actually tearing open the tape. I asked him what he was doing, and he said he wanted to verify the contents to make sure it wasn't something dangerous before bringing it inside. I pointed out that the package had my name on it, so he had no right to open it. That's when he said something that made me realise how delusional this whole situation had become. Listen, he said, we share this porch space, so technically any packages delivered here are community property until we sort out who they belong to. Community property. He actually said that with a straight face. I grabbed my package, which was already half opened, and told him that if I caught him touching my deliveries again, I'd be calling the police for mail theft. He got defensive and said he was just trying to help keep the porch organised and secure. According to him, I was being ungrateful for his efforts to maintain our shared space. I've since arranged to have all my packages delivered to my workplace instead. It's inconvenient, but it's better than dealing with Caleb's increasingly bizarre justifications for taking things that don't belong to him. The most frustrating part is that he genuinely seems to believe his own explanations. It's not like he knows he's stealing and feels guilty about it. He's convinced himself that he's being helpful and reasonable, and that I'm the problem for not appreciating his community-minded approach to package management. That story is over. The mental gymnastics some people will perform to justify taking things that clearly belong to someone else is honestly impressive in the worst possible way. Calling packages community property because they're on a shared porch is next-level delusion. Speaking of people who operate by their own rules, this next story involves someone who apparently thought restaurant dining was a communal experience. My roommate Renee tried to join me for dinner at a restaurant, and the whole situation was absolutely wild. I was meeting a friend for dinner at this nice Italian place downtown. We'd made reservations for 6:30, and I arrived a few minutes early to get our table. The hostess seated me at a corner booth, and I ordered a drink while waiting for my friend to arrive. She texted that she was running about 10 minutes late, which was fine. I decided to go ahead and order an appetizer to share when she got there. About 5 minutes after my bruschetta arrived, this woman I'd never seen before slid into the booth across from me and grabbed a piece off the plate. "Thanks for ordering," she said, taking a bite. "I'm starving." I stared at her for a second, completely confused. "Excuse me, I think there's been some mistake. I'm waiting for someone." The woman, who looked to be in her 30s with blonde hair, just shrugged. "Oh, I'm sure there's plenty of room. This looks delicious." I told her that this was a private dinner and I was expecting my friend any minute. She needed to find her own table. "Don't be so selfish," she said, reaching for another piece of bruschetta. "Sharing is caring, right? Plus, you ordered way too much food for one person anyway." I looked around to see if maybe she was confused and thought she was meeting someone here too, but she wasn't looking around or checking her phone like someone who was waiting for company. She was just casually eating my appetizer, like she belonged there. "Mum," I said, "I don't know who you are, but this is my table and my food. You need to leave." She laughed like I'd told a hilarious joke. "Your table? It's a restaurant, honey. Tables are for everyone." I tried to explain that I had a reservation and was paying for this meal, but she waved me off. "Look, I saw you sitting here alone looking all sad, and I thought I'd keep you company. You should be thanking me." The server came by to check on us, and I immediately explained that this woman was not with me and hadn't ordered anything. "Oh, I'll just have whatever she's having," Renee said to the server. "We're sharing." I told the server very clearly that we were not sharing anything, and this person needed to be seated at her own table or us to leave. The server looked uncomfortable and said she'd get the manager. Renee rolled her eyes. "You're really making a big deal out of nothing. I just wanted to be friendly." When the manager came over, I explained the situation. This random woman had sat down at my table, uninvited, and was eating my food. "I'm just being social," Renee interrupted. She was sitting here all alone looking pathetic, so I decided to join her. Now she's being incredibly rude about it. The manager asked Renee if she had her own reservation or if she was meeting someone. She admitted she didn't, but said she thought restaurants were supposed to be community spaces where people could connect. I asked the manager to please remove this woman from my table. My friend would be arriving soon, and we had a private dinner planned. "Fine," Renee said, standing up but grabbing 2 more pieces of bruschetta. "But you're missing out on a great conversation. I have so many interesting stories." The manager escorted her to the hostess station, presumably to either seat her somewhere else or ask her to leave entirely. I watched them talking for several minutes, with Renee gesturing dramatically and pointing back at my table. My friend arrived about 5 minutes later, and I filled her in on what had happened. We thought that was the end of it, but we were wrong. About halfway through our main course, Renee appeared again. This time she didn't sit down, but she stood next to our table holding a plate. "I ordered the same pasta you got," she announced, "and I thought we could compare notes. Mine doesn't look as good as yours." Before either of us could react, she actually switched our plates, taking my half-eaten penne and leaving her untouched dish in its place. "There," she said. "Now we're even." My friend and I just stared at her in complete disbelief. The woman had literally stolen my dinner right off the table. I called the manager over again, and this time he was much more firm with Renee. He told her she needed to return my food immediately and leave the restaurant, or they would call the police. "This is discrimination," Renee declared loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. "I'm a paying customer, just like everyone else. I have a right to be here." The manager pointed out that she'd been bothering other customers and disrupting their meals, which was grounds for removal regardless of whether she'd ordered food. Renee finally returned my plate, but not before taking another bite and announcing that it was too salty anyway. The manager offered to comp our appetizer for the trouble, and we gratefully accepted. Renee was eventually escorted out, but not before she stopped at 2 other tables to ask if she could sample their food. The whole experience was so bizarre that my friend and I spent the rest of dinner trying to figure out if it was some kind of social experiment or hidden camera show. But no, apparently Some people really do think that restaurants are communal dining experiences where you can just sit down with strangers and help yourself to whatever looks good. That story comes to an end. Imagine having the confidence to walk into a restaurant, sit at someone's table, and act like they're being rude for not wanting to share their dinner with a complete stranger. Some people really live in their own reality, where normal social boundaries just don't apply. Our next story involves a roommate who took the concept of personal space and threw it completely out the window. My roommate Darius locked me out of my own apartment so he could have a date, and his reasoning was completely insane. We've been roommates for about 8 months, sharing a 2-bedroom place near campus. Generally, we get along fine and respect each other's space and schedules. Last Friday, I had plans to come home around 7 p.m. after a study group session at the library. I'd texted Darius earlier that day to let him know when I'd be back, which is something we usually do just to keep each other informed. When I got to our apartment and tried to use my key, I couldn't get the door to open more than a few inches. The security chain was on from the inside, which was weird because we never used that thing. I knocked on the door and called out for Darius. After a minute, I heard him come to the door. "Hey man," he said through the crack, "I'm kind of in the middle of something. Can you find somewhere else to hang out for a few hours?" I asked him what he meant by somewhere else to hang out. This was my apartment too. I paid half the rent and had every right to be there. I know, Darius said, but I have this girl over and things are going really well. I don't want to mess up the vibe, you know. I told him I understood he had company, but I needed to get into my own home. I had homework to do, and I was tired from being at the library all day. "Come on, be a bro about this," he pleaded. "Just give me 3 or 4 hours. You could go to a coffee shop or something." I pointed out that it was already evening, and most coffee shops would be closing soon. Plus, I had all my textbooks and materials inside the apartment that I needed for an assignment due Monday morning. "Can't you do your homework somewhere else? The library's open late on Fridays." I was getting frustrated at this point. I explained that I'd already spent 6 hours at the library and had specifically come home to work in my own space with my own stuff. "Look," Darius said, "I really like this girl, and this might be my only shot with her. I promise I'll make it up to you somehow." I asked him why he couldn't just explain to his date that his roommate lived there too and would be coming home. Most reasonable people would understand that. "She doesn't know I have a roommate," he admitted. "I might have told her I live alone." This was getting more ridiculous by the minute. I told Darius he needed to either tell his date the truth or take her somewhere else, because I wasn't going to be locked out of my own apartment. "I can't take her anywhere else. She's already here, and we ordered food delivery. Everything's all set up." I reminded him that he'd known I was coming home at 7 p.m. because I texted him about it. He could have planned his date for a different time or location. "I forgot about your text until she was already on her way over. By then it was too late to change plans." I was standing in the hallway of our apartment building, having this absurd conversation through a barely open door. Other tenants were walking by and staring at the situation. I told Darius he had 5 minutes to either let me in or I was going to call the building manager to help resolve this. "Don't be dramatic," he said. "I'm not asking for much, just a few hours of privacy in my own place." I corrected him that it wasn't his own place. It was our shared apartment that we both paid for equally. "Technically, yeah, but I'm the one on the lease," Darius said. This wasn't even true. We were both on the lease as equal tenants. I pulled out my phone and showed him a photo of our lease agreement that I'd saved. "Okay, fine, we're both on the lease," he admitted, "but I found the place first. That should count for something." I told him it counted for absolutely nothing, and he needed to let me in immediately, or I really would call the manager. "Listen," Darius said, lowering his voice, "this girl is really important to me. I've been trying to ask her out for months, and she finally said yes. I can't blow this opportunity." I said I understood that the date was important to him, but that didn't give him the right to lock me out of my home. He should have thought about the logistics before inviting her over. "What if I pay for your dinner somewhere? You could go to that nice steakhouse you like. My treat." I told him I didn't want to go to a restaurant. I wanted to be in my own apartment doing my homework and relaxing after a long day. The conversation went in circles for another 10 minutes. Darius kept coming up with increasingly desperate offers to get me to leave voluntarily, while I kept insisting that I had every right to be in my own home. Finally, I heard a woman's voice from inside the apartment asking if everything was okay. "Just a neighbour with a noise complaint," Darius called back to her. "I'm handling it." A neighbour with a noise complaint? He was actually lying to both of us at this point. I raised my voice so she could hear me clearly. "I'm not a neighbour. I'm his roommate, and I live here. He's locked me out of my own apartment." There was silence from inside. Then some muffled conversation I couldn't make out. A few minutes later, Darius opened the door, looking defeated. "Thanks a lot," he said sarcastically. "She's leaving." I walked into my own apartment and saw a woman I didn't recognize gathering her things from the living room. "I'm sorry about the confusion," I said to her. "I didn't realize Darius hadn't mentioned he had a roommate." She looked embarrassed and a little annoyed. "Yeah, that would have been good information to have up front," she said, giving Darius a pointed look. After she left, Darius was furious with me. He said I'd ruined his chance with someone he really cared about. I told him that he'd ruined it himself by lying to her about living alone and then trying to lock his roommate out to maintain the deception. "You could have just stayed out for a few hours," he argued. "It wouldn't have killed you." I explained that the principle mattered more than the inconvenience. I wasn't going to be locked out of my own home, so he could maintain a lie to his date. The whole situation created tension between us for days afterward. Darius kept bringing up how I'd sabotaged his relationship, while I maintained that he'd created the problem himself through poor planning and dishonesty. The woman never came back over, and Darius blamed me entirely for the failed relationship. That story is finished. The level of entitlement required to lock your roommate out of their own home so you can maintain a lie to a date is honestly staggering. Some people really think their dating life takes priority over other people's basic rights to their living space. Next up, we have a neighbour who apparently thought public sidewalks were a toll road. My neighbour Ivy tried to charge me for walking on the sidewalk in front of her house and somehow made it seem like a legitimate business transaction. I've lived on the same street for 3 years and walk my dog past her house twice a day, every day. It's a public sidewalk that the city maintains, and I've never had any issues with neighbours about using it. Last Monday morning, I was heading out for my usual walk when Ivy stepped out of her front door, holding a clipboard and calculator. "Excuse me," she called out, "but I need to talk to you about your sidewalk usage." I stopped and asked what she meant by sidewalk usage. I was just walking my dog like I did every day. "Right, but you've been using the sidewalk section in front of my property without compensating me for the wear and tear," she said, completely serious. I explained that it was a public sidewalk and anyone was allowed to use it. That's literally what sidewalks are for. "Well, yes, technically it's public, but I'm the one who has to maintain it. I sweep it, I shovel snow in the winter, I even pressure wash it sometimes. It's only fair that frequent users help cover those costs." I told her that sidewalk maintenance was the city's responsibility, not hers. She didn't own that section of concrete. "Actually," Ivy said, consulting her clipboard, "according to my research, the property line extends to the curb, which means homeowners are responsible for sidewalk upkeep. Even if that were true, which I doubted, that still wouldn't give her the right to charge people for walking on a public sidewalk." "Look," she said, "I've been tracking your usage patterns for the past month. You walk by here twice a day, 7 days a week. That's 14 passes per week, 56 passes per month. At 50 cents per pass, you owe me $28 for March." I stared at her, waiting for her to laugh or indicate that this was some kind of joke. She was completely serious. I told her I wasn't paying anyone to use a public sidewalk and walked away. She called after me that she'd be sending me an invoice. I thought that would be the end of it, but when I got home from work that evening, there was an envelope taped to my front door. Inside was a handwritten invoice on notebook paper. "Sidewalk usage fee, March 2023, it read. 56 passes at 0 by 50 each, tag 28 all words, payment due within 10 business days. At the bottom, she'd drawn what looked like an official seal and signed it Ivy Henderson, Sidewalk Maintenance Coordinator. I threw the fake invoice in the trash and figured Ivy would eventually realise how ridiculous she was being. The next morning, she was waiting outside again with her clipboard. "I wanted to remind you about the outstanding balance on your account," she said as I approached with my dog. I told her there was no outstanding balance because I wasn't participating in her made-up sidewalk fee system. "Well, if you're going to continue using the sidewalk without paying, I'll have to start charging interest. It's only fair." I asked her if she was charging every single person who walked on the sidewalk in front of her house. "Just the regular users," she said. "People who walk by once in a while don't cause significant wear, but daily users like you really impact the concrete." I pointed out that I probably weighed less than half what she did, so if anyone was causing wear and tear, it would be her. "That's different," Ivy said. "I live here. I have a right to use my own sidewalk as much as I want." Again, it wasn't her sidewalk, but she seemed determined to ignore that fact. Over the next week, Ivy became increasingly aggressive about collecting her imaginary fees. She'd time her appearances to coincide with my walks and present me with updated invoices that included late fees and interest charges. "You're up to $35 now," she announced on Friday morning. "The longer you wait to pay, the more expensive it gets." I told her she could send me 1,000,000 fake invoices, and I still wasn't going to pay a single cent for using a public sidewalk. "Fine," she said, "but I'm keeping detailed records of all your unauthorized usage. This is going to be a very expensive lesson for you." The situation escalated when I came home the following Monday to find orange traffic cones blocking the sidewalk in front of Ivy's house. She'd put up a handwritten sign that read, "Private sidewalk, $1 per use, exact change only." I moved the cones aside and continued on my normal route. Ivy came running out of her house immediately. "You can't just ignore the toll system," she shouted. "That's theft of services." I told her that blocking a public sidewalk was actually illegal, and she needed to remove the cones before someone called the city about it. "I called the city myself," Ivy said proudly. "They confirmed that property owners are responsible for sidewalk maintenance, which gives me the right to charge usage fees." I seriously doubted the city had told her any such thing, but I decided to call them myself to clarify the situation. When I spoke to someone in the Public Works Department, they confirmed that while property owners are responsible for keeping adjacent sidewalks clean and safe, they absolutely cannot charge people for using them or block public access. The representative said they'd send someone out to address the situation immediately. An hour later, a city worker knocked on Ivy's door and had a lengthy conversation with her about public right-of-way laws. I watched from my window as she argued with him, waving her fake invoices and pointing at her toll sign. Eventually, she was forced to remove all the cones and signage. The city worker also left her with a warning about blocking public sidewalks. But Ivy wasn't done yet. That evening, she knocked on my door with a new approach. "Since the city won't let me charge tolls," she said, "I'm offering you the opportunity to purchase a monthly sidewalk pass. For just $20, you can have unlimited access to the sidewalk in front of my house for 30 days. I told her I already had unlimited access because it was a public sidewalk that everyone could use for free. "Yes, but with a monthly pass, you won't have to worry about me documenting your usage or calculating wear and tear costs," she explained. I asked her what would happen if I didn't buy her fake sidewalk pass. "Well, I can't legally stop you from using the sidewalk," she admitted, "but I can make the experience unpleasant." That sounded like a threat, so I told her I'd be reporting this conversation to the police if she continued harassing me. "It's not harassment," Ivy protested. "It's just good business." I closed the door and called the non-emergency police line to document her behaviour. They said they'd send an officer to speak with her about appropriate neighbour relations. After the police visit, Ivy finally stopped trying to collect sidewalk fees. She still glares at me when I walk by her house, but she's kept her clipboards and calculators inside. The whole experience made me realise that some people will try to monetize literally anything if they think they can get away with it. That story is over. The fact that she actually created fake invoices and tried to set up a toll booth on a public sidewalk shows a level of entrepreneurial delusion that's honestly kind of impressive. Some people really think they can just declare ownership of things that belong to everyone. Moving on to our next story, which involves someone who took the phrase, "my house is your house," way too literally. This stranger, Leland, followed me home, claiming he lived at my address, and the whole situation was absolutely terrifying. I was walking back from the grocery store last Saturday, around 4 p.m, when I noticed someone following about 20 feet behind me. At first, I thought it was just coincidence, since we were walking in the same direction. But when I turned onto my street, he turned too. When I stopped at my front gate, he walked right up behind me. "Finally," he said. I was starting to think I'd never find my way home. I turned around and saw a man in his 40s wearing a wrinkled button-down shirt and carrying a duffel bag. I'd never seen him before in my life. I asked him if I could help him with something, thinking maybe he was lost and looking for directions. "Yeah, you can move out of the way so I can get to my front door," he said, matter-of-factly. I told him this was my house, and he must have the wrong address. My name was on the mailbox right next to where we were standing. "No, this is definitely my place," Leland insisted. "I've lived here for 8 years. You must be confused." I pulled out my keys and showed him that I had the key to the front door. If this was his house, how would I have a key? "Those must be copies," he said. "I gave you permission to stay here while I was travelling, but now I'm back and I need you to leave." I had absolutely no idea what he was talking about. I'd never met this person before, and I'd lived in this house for 3 years. "Look," Leland said, getting impatient, "I don't know what kind of scam you're trying to pull, but this is my property. I can prove it." He pulled out his phone and showed me a photo of my house taken from the street. "See, that's my front porch, my mailbox, my garden, everything exactly as I left it." I pointed out that anyone could take a photo of any house from the public sidewalk. "That didn't prove ownership." "Fine," he said. "Then explain how I know there's a blue bathroom on the second floor and a kitchen window that faces the backyard." These were pretty generic features that could describe thousands of houses. I told him he was going to need to leave my property immediately. "Your property?" Leland laughed. "I have the deed to this place. I pay the mortgage. I planted those rose bushes you've been enjoying." I asked him to show me this deed he claimed to have. He patted his pockets and said he must have left it inside. "Just give me the keys so I can get my paperwork and prove this is my house," he said, holding out his hand expectantly. I told him I wasn't giving my keys to a stranger, and he needed to leave before I called the police. "Go ahead and call them," Leland said confidently. "They'll straighten this whole thing out. I'm sure they have records of who really owns this address." I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. While I was talking to the dispatcher, Leland walked around to my backyard like he owned the place. When the police arrived 10 minutes later, they found Leland sitting on my back patio examining my outdoor furniture. "Officer," he called out when he saw them, "thank goodness you're here. This woman is squatting in my house and refuses to leave." I showed the officers my driver's license, with my current address, my utility bills, my mortgage statements, and my house keys. Everything clearly established that I lived there. Leland, meanwhile, couldn't produce any documentation whatsoever. He claimed all his important papers were inside the house, and he just needed to get in to retrieve them. "Sir," one of the officers said, "do you have any identification that shows this address as your residence?" Leland pulled out his driver's license, which showed a completely different address across town. "Oh, that's my old address," he explained. "I haven't updated it yet since moving back here." The officer asked when he'd supposedly moved back. Leland said it was just yesterday, which was why he didn't have updated documents yet. "So you're saying you lived here 8 years ago, moved away, and just moved back yesterday?" the officer clarified. "Exactly," Leland nodded. "I've been travelling for work, but this has always been my permanent residence." The officers asked me how long I'd lived at the address. I showed them my mortgage closing documents from 3 years ago, proving I'd purchased the house from the previous owners. "There must be some mistake in the paperwork," Leland insisted. "I never sold this house to anyone." One of the officers asked Leland if he could describe the interior of the house to prove his familiarity with it. Of course, he said confidently. The living room has hardwood floors and white walls. The kitchen has cabinets and a refrigerator. There's a staircase leading to the bedrooms upstairs. These descriptions could have applied to probably half the houses in the neighbourhood. I offered to let the officers inside to verify that Leland had no personal belongings there and that all the furniture and possessions clearly belonged to me. We walked through every room, and it was obvious that this was my home. My photos on the walls, my clothes in the closets, my food in the refrigerator, my mail on the counter. Leland kept insisting that I must have removed all his stuff and replaced it with mine in the short time between when he'd left for work that morning and when he'd returned home. She's very thorough, he told the officers admiringly. I have to give her credit for the attention to detail. The officers were clearly losing patience with his increasingly absurd explanations. Sir, one of them said firmly, you need to accept that this is not your house. The documentation is clear, and you have no evidence to support your claim. What about squatters' rights? Leland asked desperately. I've been living here for years. That has to count for something. The officer explained that squatters' rights don't apply when someone already has clear legal ownership of a property. Finally, they escorted Leland off my property and warned him not to return. They said if I saw him around my house again, I should call immediately. This isn't over, Leland called back as they walked him to his car. I know where I live, even if you don't believe me. I made sure to lock all my doors and windows that night. The whole experience left me feeling violated and unsafe in my own home. The next morning I found Leland sitting on my front steps when I left for work. I thought about it all night, he said, and I think I know what happened. You probably bought this house in good faith, not realizing it was stolen from me through some kind of real estate fraud. Thus, I called the police again, and they arrested him for trespassing. He spent the night in jail and was released with a restraining order that prohibited him from coming within 500 feet of my address. I later learned from the officers that Leland had a history of similar incidents. Apparently, he tried to claim ownership of at least 3 other houses in the past 2 years, always with the same story about returning from travel to find squatters in his home. The whole thing was apparently some kind of mental health issue combined with potential housing instability, but that didn't make it any less frightening to deal with. That story is over. The commitment to maintaining that delusion, even when confronted with legal documents and police officers, is genuinely concerning. Some people create alternate realities so convincing that they start believing them themselves, which makes the situation dangerous for everyone involved. Our next tale involves a friend who apparently thought offering someone a ride came with hidden fees. My friend Clara demanded I reimburse her for gas after she had offered me a ride, and the whole experience made me question our friendship. Last month I was having car trouble and mentioned to Clara that I needed to get to a medical appointment across town. She immediately volunteered to drive me, saying it was no problem and she was happy to help. The appointment was scheduled for 2 p.m. on a Thursday, and Clara picked me up right on time. During the drive, we had a normal conversation about work and weekend plans. She didn't mention anything about gas money or expecting reimbursement. After my appointment, Clara drove me back home, and I thanked her multiple times for taking time out of her day to help me. She said it was no big deal, and she was glad she could help out a friend. The next morning, I woke up to a Venmo request from Clara for $48. The note said, gas reimbursement for Thursday ride, 96 miles total at $0.50 per mile. I was completely confused. Clara lived about 15 minutes away from me, and the medical office was maybe 20 minutes from my house. Even with her driving to pick me up and drop me off, we couldn't have driven more than 30 miles total. I texted Clara asking about the Venmo request. She replied immediately, saying she'd calculated the total mileage for the entire trip and thought 50 cents per mile was a fair rate. I told her I appreciated the ride, but $48 seemed excessive for maybe an hour of driving around town. I offered to give her $10 for gas. Actually, Clara texted back, I did some research, and the IRS standard mileage rate is 0.655 per mile this year, so technically you owe me more like $63. I called her because this conversation was getting ridiculous. When she answered, I asked why she was suddenly charging me for a ride she'd offered to give me for free. I never said it was free, Clara insisted. I said I was happy to help, which I was, but gas costs money and my time is valuable. I reminded her that she'd volunteered to drive me when I mentioned needing transportation. I hadn't asked her to do it or offered to pay her. Just because I offered doesn't mean I should have to pay for everything myself, she said. Friends help each other out, but they also respect each other's expenses. I pointed out that if she'd wanted reimbursement, she should have mentioned it before we left, not surprise me with a bill the next day. I shouldn't have to ask for basic consideration, Clara replied. It's common courtesy to offer gas money when someone drives you somewhere. I asked her to break down how she'd calculated 96 miles for what should have been a 30-mile round trip at most. Well, Clara said, I had to drive from my house to your house, then to the medical office, then back to your house, then back to my house. Plus I had to stop for gas on the way home. I told her that her drive home was not part of my transportation needs. She was going home anyway, so I shouldn't be charged for her return trip. But I wouldn't have needed to drive at all if you hadn't needed a ride, she argued. The whole outing was for your benefit. The conversation was going nowhere. I told Clara I'd give her $15 for gas, which was more than fair for the actual distance we'd travelled. That doesn't even cover half my costs, she complained. I'm losing money helping you. I asked her why she'd offered to help if she felt like she'd be losing money on the deal. I was being nice, Clara said, but being nice doesn't mean I should have to subsidise your transportation costs. I pointed out that nobody had asked her to subsidise anything. She'd volunteered to give me a ride, and now she was acting like I'd forced her into some expensive commitment. Fine, Clara said, but don't expect me to offer rides anymore if you're not willing to be fair about expenses. I told her that was perfectly fine with me. If she wanted to turn every favour into a business transaction, I'd make other arrangements in the future. You're being really selfish about this, she said. I went out of my way to help you, and you don't even want to cover my costs. I reminded her one more time that she'd volunteered to help and hadn't mentioned any costs up front. Springing a $48 bill on someone the next day wasn't reasonable. The conversation ended with both of us frustrated. Clara never did explain how a local trip had supposedly cost her nearly $50 in gas. A few days later, she sent me another Vembo request, this time for $30, as a compromise. I declined the request and sent her $15 with a note saying this was for gas only. Clara accepted the payment, but didn't speak to me for 2 weeks afterward. When she finally did text me again, it was to ask if I could help her move some furniture. I told her I'd be happy to help, but my hourly rate for moving services was $25 plus mileage. She got offended and asked why I was suddenly charging her when friends are supposed to help each other for free. I explained that I was just following her business model of charging friends for any expenses or time involved in helping them. That's completely different, Clara protested. Moving furniture is actual work. I asked her how driving someone to a medical appointment wasn't actual work if it involved her time, gas and vehicle wear. She couldn't come up with a good answer to that question. That story is over. The selective logic of wanting to charge friends for favours while expecting free help in return is peak entitlement. Some people really think kindness is a one-way street, where they're always on the receiving end. Our next story features a neighbour's kid who took creative entrepreneurship to a whole new level. My neighbour's kid Omar tried to sell me back my own bike, and his business proposal was absolutely shameless. I have a decent mountain bike that I keep in my garage and take out for rides on weekends. It's nothing fancy, but I've had it for about 3 years, and it's in good condition. Last Sunday morning, I went out to the garage to get my bike for a ride and discovered it was gone. I looked everywhere, thinking maybe I'd moved it or lent it to someone and forgotten. But it was definitely missing. I checked with my roommate to see if he'd borrowed it or moved it somewhere. He hadn't seen it either. That's when I realised someone must have stolen it from my garage. I was pretty upset because I really enjoyed my weekend rides, and replacing the bike would cost several $100s. I filed a police report, but the officer said bike thefts were common and recovery was unlikely. Monday evening, I was getting home from work when I saw a kid, maybe 14 years old, riding a bike down my street. As he got closer, I realised it was my exact bike, same colour, same brand, same little scratch on the frame that I'd gotten from a tree branch last summer. I called out to him and asked him to stop. When he rode over, I told him that bike looked exactly like mine that had been stolen from my garage. "Oh wow, really?" Omar said, looking concerned. "That's crazy. This bike was given to me by my uncle." I asked him which uncle and when he'd gotten it. Omar said it was his uncle from out of state who'd visited over the weekend. I pointed out the distinctive scratch on the frame and asked if he'd noticed that when his uncle gave it to him. "Yeah, my uncle mentioned that," Omar said smoothly. "He said it happened when he was learning to ride as a kid." The story was getting more elaborate by the minute, but I was certain this was my bike. I told Omar I was going to call the police to report that my stolen bike had been found. "Wait," he said quickly. "Maybe we can work something out. I really like this bike, and I've gotten attached to it." I told him he couldn't get attached to stolen property, and he needed to return it immediately. "Okay, but here's the thing," Omar said. "I've made some improvements to it since I got it. I adjusted the seat height and tightened the brakes. That's worth something, right?" I looked at the bike and couldn't see any improvements at all. It looked exactly the same as when it had been stolen from my garage. "Plus," Omar continued, "I've been taking really good care of it. No scratches or anything. Well, except for that one, but that was already there." I told him again that this was my bike and he needed to give it back right now. "I understand your position," Omar said seriously, "but I've put time and effort into this bike. If you want it back, I think $60 would be fair compensation." I stared at him in disbelief. This kid had stolen my bike and was now trying to charge me to get it back. I told Omar I wasn't paying him anything, and if he didn't return my property immediately, I was calling the police. Okay, don't get upset," he said. "I'm a reasonable person. How about $40? That's my final offer." I pulled out my phone and started dialing. Omar quickly backpedaled. "Look, I didn't steal your bike," he insisted. "My uncle really did give it to me, but if you're absolutely sure it's yours, maybe we can make a deal." I asked him what kind of deal he thought was appropriate for returning stolen property. "Well, I've been using it for 2 days now," Omar explained. "That's like a rental fee situation, plus storage costs for keeping it safe in my garage." The kid was trying to charge me rental and storage fees for my own bike that he'd stolen. I told him he had 30 seconds to get off my bike before I called the police. "Fine, but this seems really unfair," Omar said, climbing off reluctantly. "I was taking good care of it for you. That should be worth something." I got on my bike and immediately noticed that the seat was adjusted completely wrong and the gears were all messed up. Whatever improvements Omar claimed to have made had actually damaged the bike's settings. "Hey," Omar called after me as I was wheeling the bike toward my garage. "If you ever want to sell it, I'll give you $40 cash." I ignored him and put my bike away, making sure to lock the garage this time. The next day, Omar knocked on my front door. When I answered, he was holding a clipboard and wearing what looked like a makeshift business uniform. "I wanted to follow up on yesterday's transaction," he said professionally. "I think there might have been some miscommunication about the terms." I told him there had been no transaction and no terms. He'd stolen my bike and I'd taken it back. End of story. "Actually," Omar said, consulting his clipboard, "I've been thinking about this from a business perspective. You got your bike back in good condition, thanks to my care and maintenance. I think a small service fee would be appropriate." I asked him if he was seriously trying to charge me for not completely destroying my bike while he had it illegally. "It's not about what I didn't do," Omar explained. "It's about the value I added. I kept it clean. I made sure no one else stole it. I even tested the brakes to make sure they worked properly." I told Omar that if he didn't stop harassing me about payment for returning my stolen property, I really would call the police. "Okay, but just so you know," he said, backing away from my door, "I run a bike security service now. For just $10 a week, I'll make sure no one steals your bike again." I closed the door and watched through the window as Omar walked to the next house, apparently expanding his protection racket to other neighbours. That story is over. The sheer nerve of stealing someone's bike and then trying to negotiate a finder's fee for its return is honestly impressive in the worst way possible. This kid has a future in organised crime if he keeps developing these entrepreneurial skills. Moving into our next tale, we have someone who took personal grooming into their own hands without permission. This stranger, Nadine, tried to cut my hair in public without asking, and her justification was completely unhinged. I was sitting in a coffee shop last Tuesday morning, working on my laptop and minding my own business. I'd grabbed a table near the window and was enjoying a quiet morning before heading to work. I have fairly long hair that I usually wear down, and I'll admit it probably needed a trim. I'd been meaning to make a hair appointment, but kept putting it off because I hate dealing with salons. About halfway through my latte, I felt someone touch my hair from behind. I turned around and saw a woman in her 50s standing behind my chair with a pair of small scissors in her hand. "Don't worry," she said calmly. "I'm just going to clean up these split ends. You'll thank me when I'm done." I immediately stood up and backed away from her, asking what she thought she was doing. "I'm a licensed cosmetologist," Nadine explained. Like that justified anything. I couldn't stand watching you sit there with damaged hair. It was driving me crazy. I told her she couldn't just start cutting a stranger's hair without permission, regardless of her qualifications. "Look at these ends," she said, reaching toward my hair again. "They're completely fried. You're probably losing inches of length every month, just from breakage." I stepped further away and told her to keep her hands and scissors to herself. "I'm trying to help you," Nadine insisted. "Do you know how much a professional trim would cost at a salon? I'm offering to do it for free right here." I pointed out that I was in a coffee shop, not a hair salon, and I hadn't asked for her help or opinion about my hair. "Sometimes people don't know what they need until someone else points it out," she said. "Trust me, you'll feel so much better with a proper cut." I told her I was perfectly fine with my hair the way it was, and she needed to leave me alone. "But it's so damaged," Nadine protested. "Look, I'll just trim off the worst parts. It'll take 2 minutes, and you'll see such a difference." She actually started approaching me again, with the scissors. I had to physically move to another part of the coffee shop to get away from her. "You're being very stubborn about this," Nadine called after me. "I'm trying to do you a favour." Other customers were starting to stare at the situation. A few people had their phones out, like they were recording the bizarre encounter. I asked one of the baristas to help me deal with this woman who was trying to cut my hair against my will. The barista, a young guy who looked as confused as I felt, approached Nadine and asked her to put away the scissors. "I'm a professional," she told him. "I know what I'm doing. This woman desperately needs hair care." The barista explained that she couldn't cut people's hair in the coffee shop and asked her to please stop bothering other customers. "This is discrimination against hair care professionals," Nadine declared loudly. "I'm trying to provide a public service." She waved her scissors around while talking, which made several people nearby move away from her. The barista threatened to call the police if she didn't put the scissors away and leave other customers alone. "Fine," Nadine said, "but I'm leaving my business card in case you change your mind about that trim." She actually had business cards with her. She left one on my table and walked toward the exit. But instead of leaving, Nadine positioned herself near the door and watched me from across the coffee shop. Every few minutes, she'd shake her head disapprovingly and point at my hair. I tried to ignore her and get back to my work, but it was impossible to concentrate with her staring at me and making exaggerated gestures about the state of my hair. After about 20 minutes of this, she approached my table again. "I've been observing your hair from different angles," she announced, "and it's even worse than I initially thought. You really need professional intervention." I told her I was going to call the police if she didn't leave me alone. I'm not bothering you, Nadine said. I'm just sitting in a public establishment, making professional observations. She pulled out a notebook and started writing in it while looking at my hair. What are you writing? I asked. Hair damage assessment, she replied seriously. Split ends, uneven length, obvious signs of heat damage, probable protein deficiency. This is really fascinating from a professional standpoint. I gathered my things and decided to leave. As I was packing up my laptop, Nadine made one final attempt. Wait, she said. I have an idea. What if I just show you how much better it would look? I could just trim one little section as a demonstration. I told her absolutely not and headed for the door. You're making a mistake, she called after me. Hair damage only gets worse over time. You'll regret not taking advantage of this opportunity. As I was leaving, I heard her approach another customer, a woman with shoulder-length blonde hair. Excuse me, I heard Nadine say, but have you considered layers? Your face shape would really benefit from some strategic cutting. I left before I could see how that interaction played out. The whole experience made me paranoid about sitting with my back to strangers in public places. Who carries scissors around and just decides to start cutting people's hair? That story is over. The fact that she had business cards ready and was taking notes on random strangers' hair suggests this wasn't her first time attempting unauthorized styling services. Some people really think their professional expertise gives them the right to physically alter other people without consent. Next up, we have a neighbour who took home improvement into his own hands, literally. Our next story features a neighbour who took home improvement into his own hands, literally, in my yard. My neighbour Gerald painted part of my house while I was away and somehow thought this was doing me a favour. I went out of town for a long weekend to visit family, leaving Thursday morning and planning to return Sunday evening. My house is a pale yellow colour that I've always liked, and it's been that way since I bought the place 2 years ago. When I pulled into my driveway Sunday night, I immediately noticed something was wrong. The entire west-facing wall of my house was now bright blue instead of yellow. Not a subtle blue, but an electric, almost neon blue that could probably be seen from space. I sat in my car for a full minute trying to process what I was seeing. There was no way I was hallucinating this. Someone had literally painted one wall of my house a completely different colour while I was gone. I got out and walked around to examine the paint job. It was actually well done from a technical standpoint, with clean edges and even coverage, but it was my house, and I definitely hadn't authorised anyone to paint it. My first thought was vandalism, but this seemed like way too much effort for a prank. This was several gallons of paint and hours of work. That's when I noticed Gerald next door, watering his plants. He waved cheerfully and walked over to the fence between our properties. Hey, welcome back, he called out. What do you think of the improvement? I asked him what he meant by improvement. The blue wall, Gerald said proudly. I thought that yellow was looking pretty faded on that side of the house, so I decided to freshen it up for you while you were away. I stared at him, trying to understand what he was telling me. He'd painted my house without permission. Well, not the whole house, Gerald clarified. Just that one wall. I ran out of paint, but I can finish the rest next weekend if you want. I told him I didn't want him to finish anything. I wanted to know why he'd painted my house at all. It needed it, Gerald said matter-of-factly. That yellow was starting to look dingy, especially compared to my house. It was bringing down the whole neighbourhood aesthetic. I pointed out that it was my house, and my choice what colour to paint it. Sure, but you weren't here to ask, Gerald said. I figured you'd appreciate the surprise. Blue is much more modern than that old yellow. I asked him where he'd gotten the idea that he could just paint someone else's property without asking. I'm retired, Gerald explained. I have time to notice these things and help out my neighbours. The paint was on sale at Home Depot, so it seemed like perfect timing. I told him that regardless of his good intentions, he'd damaged my property, and I wanted it returned to its original colour immediately. Damaged? Gerald looked offended. I improved it. That blue is a much better choice for your house style. You should be thanking me. I explained that I liked the yellow colour and had chosen it specifically when I bought the house. "You'll like the blue better once you get used to it," Gerald assured me. "Sometimes people resist change, but this is definitely an upgrade." I asked him if he would appreciate me painting part of his house without asking. "If it needed it, sure," Gerald said. "That's what neighbours do for each other." I told him I was going to call the police and report this as property damage. "That seems extreme," Gerald said. "I was trying to help you out. The least you could do is offer to pay me back for the paint." He actually wanted me to reimburse him for painting my house without permission. I told him he had 24 hours to repaint that wall back to yellow, or I'd be filing a formal complaint. "I don't have any yellow paint," Gerald said. "And honestly, I think you're overreacting. Give it a week, and you'll love the new look." I went inside and called the non-emergency police line to report property damage. The officer who came out agreed that Gerald had committed vandalism by painting my house without consent. When the officer spoke with Gerald, he maintained that he'd been doing me a favour and couldn't understand why I was upset about receiving free home improvement. "I'm a good painter," Gerald told the officer. "She should be grateful for the professional work." The officer explained that regardless of the quality of the work, you can't paint someone else's property without permission. Gerald was given a citation for property damage and ordered to restore my house to its original condition within 2 weeks or face additional charges. He spent the next day at Home Depot trying to match my original yellow paint. It took 3 attempts, but he finally got close enough to the original colour. While he was repainting, Gerald kept muttering about how ungrateful some people are and how the blue had looked so much better. "You're making a mistake going back to that yellow," he called over to me, "but I guess some people just don't have an eye for colour." The repainting job wasn't quite perfect, and I ended up having to touch up several spots myself, but at least my house was back to looking like my house. Gerald hasn't spoken to me since, which is honestly fine by me. Every time I see him in his yard, he shakes his head disapprovingly at my yellow wall. That story's finished. The confidence required to repaint someone's house and then act like they should be grateful is honestly breathtaking. Some people really think their aesthetic opinions override other people's property rights. Our next adventure takes us to a local park where someone redefined the rules of recreational equipment sharing. This guy, Isaac, took my frisbee and refused to give it back, insisting that park equipment was fair game for anyone. I was at Riverside Park last Saturday afternoon with my girlfriend, playing frisbee on the big open field where people usually throw around discs and footballs. We'd been tossing it back and forth for maybe 20 minutes when my throw went a little wide. The frisbee landed about 30 feet away from us, right near where this guy was sitting on a blanket reading a book. Instead of ignoring it or tossing it back our way, he picked it up and examined it like he was appraising a piece of art. I jogged over and said, "Thanks, that's ours." I held out my hand, expecting him to hand over the frisbee. Isaac looked up at me and said, "Actually, I think I'll hold on to this for a while. It's a nice one." I told him it was my frisbee and I needed it back so we could keep playing. "Well, you threw it over here," Isaac said. "Seems like you didn't want it anymore." I explained that it was an accidental throw, and obviously I wanted my frisbee back. "Finders keepers," Isaac said with a shrug. "That's how parks work. If you can't control where your stuff goes, you risk losing it." I stared at him, waiting for him to laugh or indicate he was joking, but he just sat there holding my frisbee like it belonged to him now. My girlfriend walked over to see what was taking so long. I explained that this guy had picked up our frisbee and was refusing to give it back. "That's ridiculous," she said to Isaac. "Obviously it's not yours." "It is now," Isaac replied calmly. "Possession is 9/10 of the law." I told him that wasn't how frisbee worked. When someone's disc lands near you at a park, you throw it back or hand it to them. You don't just claim it as your own. "Says who?" Isaac asked. "I don't see your name on it." Actually, my name was written on the underside in permanent marker, which I pointed out immediately. Isaac flipped the frisbee over and saw my name clearly written there. For a moment, I thought this would end the ridiculous situation. "Anyone could have written this," he said. How do I know you didn't just write your name on someone else's frisbee? I pulled out my phone and showed him a photo I'd taken earlier that morning of me and my girlfriend at my apartment, with the same frisbee visible on my kitchen counter. Photos can be faked, Isaac said dismissively. This doesn't prove anything. My girlfriend asked him what it would take to convince him that the frisbee belonged to us. Nothing, Isaac said. I found it, so now it's mine. If you want to play frisbee, you should bring a backup. I told him I was going to call park security if he didn't return my property immediately. Go ahead, Isaac said. They'll tell you the same thing I'm telling you. Parks are public spaces where anything left unattended becomes community property. I looked around and saw a park ranger walking near the playground area. I flagged him down and explained the situation. The ranger, a middle-aged guy who looked like he'd dealt with weird park disputes before, listened to both sides of the story. Sir, he said to Isaac, that's clearly not how park etiquette works. If someone's frisbee lands near you during a game, you return it to them. But I found it, Isaac insisted. It was just sitting on the ground when I picked it up. I explained that it had been in the air for maybe 2 seconds before landing near his blanket. I didn't see it flying, Isaac claimed. For all I know, it had been there for hours. The ranger asked Isaac if he'd brought a frisbee to the park with him. No, but that doesn't matter, Isaac said. I found this one fair and square. The ranger explained that taking someone's recreational equipment at a park was essentially theft, and Isaac needed to return the frisbee immediately. This is discrimination against people who don't bring their own sports-afford frisbees. The ranger points equipment, Isaac complained. Not everyone can out that basic frisbees, cost about $5 at any store. $5 I don't have to spend now, Isaac said, clutching my frisbee tighter. The ranger gave Isaac a choice: return the frisbee voluntarily or be escorted out of the park for theft. Isaac reluctantly handed over my frisbee, but not before making one final argument. This is really unfair, he said. I was just trying to get some exercise and now I'm being persecuted for finding abandoned equipment. As the ranger walked away, Isaac called after him. What am I supposed to throw around now? The ranger suggested he could buy his own frisbee at the sporting goods store across the street from the park. That defeats the whole purpose of finding one, Isaac muttered. He packed up his blanket and left the park, shooting dirty looks at us the entire time. My girlfriend and I continued our game, but we made sure to throw more carefully, so the frisbee wouldn't land anywhere near other people. About an hour later, as we were getting ready to leave, I saw Isaac at the park entrance examining the lost and found box like he was shopping for free equipment. That story's over. The mental gymnastics required to convince yourself that a frisbee in active use becomes abandoned property the second it touches the ground is truly impressive. Some people will use any excuse to justify taking things that clearly belong to someone else. Moving along to our next tale, we encounter a neighbour who took agricultural expansion into her own hands. My neighbour Olive tried to build a chicken coop in my yard without asking, claiming my property had better sun exposure for her birds. I own a corner lot with a decent-sized backyard that gets full sun most of the day. I've lived here for 5 years and have always maintained a simple grass lawn with a few flower beds along the fence. Last Monday morning, I was getting ready for work when I heard hammering sounds coming from my backyard. I looked out the kitchen window and saw my neighbour Olive from 3 houses down setting up what looked like wooden fence posts in my yard. I went outside and asked her what she was doing on my property. "Oh, good morning," Olive said cheerfully, not stopping her work. "I'm setting up the frame for my new chicken coop. Your yard has perfect southern exposure." I told her she couldn't build anything in my yard without permission. "Don't worry," Olive said. "I'll maintain it completely. You won't have to do anything except enjoy fresh eggs occasionally." I explained that regardless of maintenance responsibilities, she couldn't construct buildings on someone else's property. "It's not really a building," Olive corrected. "It's more like a temporary agricultural installation." I asked her why she wasn't putting the chicken coop in her own yard. "My yard is too shady," she explained. "Chickens need lots of sunlight to be healthy and lay good eggs. Your corner lot gets sun all day long." I told her that was exactly why I'd bought this particular house, and I wasn't interested in sharing my sunny backyard with chickens or chicken coops. But you're not using the space for anything productive, Olive pointed out. It's just grass. This would be much better for the environment. She'd already dug several post holes and laid out what looked like chicken wire along one section of my yard. I told her she needed to stop immediately and remove everything she'd brought onto my property. I've already put in 2 hours of work, Olive protested, and I bought all these materials specifically for this location. Can't we work something out? I asked her what kind of arrangement she had in mind. I'll give you 12 eggs every week, she offered. Fresh, organic, free-range eggs. Do you know how much those cost at the grocery store? I told her I wasn't interested in eggs or chickens, and she needed to take her project back to her own property. What if I only put the coop in the back corner? Olive suggested. You'd barely notice it there, and the chickens would help fertilize your grass. I pointed out that chicken droppings everywhere was not actually a selling point for me. You could think of it as a shared community garden space, Olive continued. The chickens would eat bugs and weeds, keeping your yard naturally pest-free. I told her for the third time that I wanted her to remove her materials and leave my yard immediately. But I've already started, Olive said, gesturing to her partially dug holes. It would be wasteful to abandon the project now. I threatened to call the police if she didn't leave voluntarily. That seems extreme for a neighbourly disagreement, Olive said. I'm offering you benefits in exchange for land use. This is basically a farming partnership. I wasn't interested in any kind of partnership and told her she had until the end of the day to clean up her mess. Fine, Olive said reluctantly, but you're missing out on a great opportunity: free eggs, natural pest control, and the satisfaction of supporting local agriculture. She spent the rest of the morning filling in the holes she'd dug and collecting her materials, but she kept muttering about what a waste it was to have such good sun exposure going unused. When I got home from work, most of her stuff was gone, but she'd left a handwritten note on my back door. If you change your mind about the chicken coop, the note read, my offer still stands. I've researched your property and identified 3 other optimal locations for poultry housing. Call me any time. She'd actually done research on chicken coop placement in my yard, like it was a serious business proposal. The next weekend, I saw Olive in her own backyard, trying to set up the same chicken coop materials in a much shadier spot. The chickens she eventually got looked perfectly healthy, despite the reduced sunlight. A few weeks later, she knocked on my front door with a carton of eggs. I wanted to show you what you're missing, she said. These came from the chickens that could have been living in your yard. I politely declined the eggs and closed the door. Through my window, I watched Olive walk around my yard one more time, shaking her head at all the wasted agricultural potential. That story is over. The confidence to just start building farm infrastructure on someone else's property and then act like they're missing out on a great business opportunity is genuinely amazing. Some people really think good intentions justify trespassing and property modification. Our next story takes us to a shopping mall where someone took customer service into their own hands. This stranger Brock tried to take my shoes off my feet at the mall, claiming he needed to inspect them for quality control. I was walking through the main corridor of Westfield Mall last Saturday, just browsing and killing time before meeting friends for dinner. I was wearing my favourite pair of sneakers, nothing fancy but comfortable and in good condition. I was looking at my phone to check the time when someone grabbed my arm and said, "Excuse me, I need to check those shoes." I looked up and saw a guy in his 30s wearing khakis and a polo shirt. He looked official enough that I initially thought he might work for mall security or something. I asked him what he meant by checking my shoes. "Quality control inspection," Brock said seriously. "I work for the manufacturer, and we've had reports of defective products in this batch. I need to examine your shoes to make sure they're safe." I looked down at my sneakers, which I'd owned for about 6 months. They seemed perfectly fine to me. "What kind of defects?" I asked. "Sole separation primarily," Brock replied. "Very dangerous. Could cause serious injury if the bottom comes off while you're walking. He knelt down and started reaching toward my feet. I stepped back and told him I wasn't comfortable with a stranger touching my shoes. "I'm not a stranger," Brock insisted. "I'm a professional footwear inspector. I have certification and everything." I asked to see his identification or credentials. "I don't carry my ID while conducting field inspections," he said. "Security protocol, but I can assure you this is legitimate." I told him my shoes felt fine, and I didn't think they needed any inspection. "You can't tell just by wearing them," Brock explained. "Sole separation happens gradually. By the time you notice, it's too late to prevent injury." He was being very persistent, and I was starting to feel uncomfortable. I told him I'd take my shoes to a store if I was concerned about them. "Store employees aren't qualified to do this level of inspection," Brock said. "I need to physically examine the construction and adhesive integrity." I told him absolutely not, and walked away quickly before he could grab my feet. "Ma'am, you're putting yourself at risk," Brock called after me. "Those shoes could fail at any moment." I kept walking and didn't look back. The whole encounter left me paranoid about weird strangers in malls who might try to touch my belongings under the guise of helping. That story is over. The creativity people use to justify grabbing strangers' property never ceases to amaze me. Apparently, now we need to worry about fake shoe inspectors lurking in shopping centres. Our next story comes from someone who learned that some neighbours think property lines are more like suggestions than actual legal boundaries. "My neighbour parked their RV in my driveway for a month and refused to move it till the city got involved." I'm 32, and I live in a quiet suburban neighbourhood where most people keep to themselves and respect each other's space. I've been in my house for about 3 years now, and I've never had any major issues with neighbours until Glenn moved in next door about 6 months ago. Glenn is probably in his late 40s, recently divorced, and he bought this massive RV shortly after moving in. The thing is enormous, like a small house on wheels, and he's been talking about taking cross-country trips to find himself, or whatever middle-aged divorced guys do when they're having a crisis. The problem started on a Tuesday morning when I was getting ready for work. I walked outside to get in my car and found Glenn's RV completely blocking my driveway. Not partially blocking it, completely taking up the entire space so I couldn't even get my car out of my garage. I walked over to Glenn's house and knocked on his door. When he answered, I politely explained that his RV was blocking my driveway and asked if he could move it. He looked confused for a moment, then said, "Oh yeah, sorry about that. I had to put it somewhere while I work on some maintenance stuff. It's just temporary." I said that was fine, but could he move it now so I could get to work? He said he was in the middle of something and would move it later that day. I had to call my boss and explain why I'd be late, then take an Uber to work because I literally couldn't get my car out. When I got home that evening, the RV was still there. I knocked on Glenn's door again, but he didn't answer, even though I could see lights on and hear his TV. I left a note on his door asking him to move the RV as soon as possible. The next morning, the RV was still blocking my driveway. I had to take another Uber to work. This time, when I talked to Glenn, he said he was waiting for some parts to come in for his maintenance and would move it as soon as he was done. He promised it would just be a few more days. Those few days turned into a week. Every morning I'd wake up hoping the RV would be gone, and every morning it was still there, taking up my entire driveway like Glenn had claimed it as his personal parking spot. I tried talking to him multiple times, but he always had some excuse. The parts were delayed. He was too busy with work. He'd get to it this weekend. Meanwhile, I was spending a fortune on rideshare apps and getting increasingly frustrated with the whole situation. After 2 weeks, I decided to check my property records to make sure I wasn't crazy. My driveway is definitely on my property, not some shared space or easement. Glenn was literally parking his RV on my land without permission. When I confronted him with this information, he got defensive and said I was being unreasonable. He claimed that neighbours should help each other out, and that I was making a big deal out of nothing. He said his driveway was too small for the RV, and he needed somewhere to park it while he worked on it. I told him that his parking problems weren't my responsibility and that he needed to move the RV immediately. He said he'd move it when he was good and ready, and that I should stop being such a difficult neighbour. 3 weeks into this nightmare, I was at my breaking point. I couldn't park in my own driveway. I was spending hundreds of dollars on transportation, and Glenn was acting like I was the unreasonable one for wanting access to my own property. I called the city's code enforcement office and explained the situation. They told me that parking an RV on someone else's property without permission was definitely a violation, and they'd send someone out to investigate. The code enforcement officer showed up the next day and confirmed that Glenn was illegally parking on my property. He left a notice on the RV stating that it needed to be moved within 48 hours or it would be towed at the owner's expense. Glenn came over that evening absolutely furious. He accused me of being petty and vindictive, said I'd escalated things unnecessarily, and that he couldn't believe I'd called the city over such a minor issue. He kept saying it was just temporary and that I should have been more patient. I told him that a month wasn't temporary and that he'd had plenty of opportunities to move the RV voluntarily before I involved the authorities. He stormed off, muttering about how neighbourhoods weren't like they used to be. The RV was finally gone the next morning, just hours before the 48-hour deadline. Glenn loaded it up and drove it to some storage facility across town, which made me wonder why he couldn't have done that from the beginning. Since then, Glenn barely speaks to me. He gives me dirty looks when we're both outside, and I've heard him complaining to other neighbours about how unreasonable I am. A few neighbours have approached me asking what happened, and when I tell them the story, they're shocked that he thought parking in my driveway for a month was acceptable. The whole experience taught me that some people will take advantage of politeness and treat it as permission to walk all over you. I spent weeks being patient and reasonable, trying to work things out neighbourly, while Glenn just ignored my requests and acted like he was entitled to use my property however he wanted. I don't regret calling the city. Sometimes you have to escalate things to get people to respect basic boundaries and property rights. That story is over. Glenn really thought he could claim someone else's driveway as his personal RV storage and then play the victim when there were consequences. The entitlement of blocking someone's access to their own home for a month and calling it temporary is absolutely staggering. Some people will test every boundary until you force them to respect basic property rights. Speaking of people who think other people's belongings are fair game, this next story involves someone who took the concept of sharing to a whole new level of audacity. A stranger tried to take my picnic food at the park and acted like I was being selfish for not sharing with everyone. This happened last weekend, and I'm still processing the sheer boldness of this encounter. I had planned a nice picnic with my girlfriend at our local park. We'd been looking forward to it all week, especially since the weather was finally nice enough to eat outside comfortably. I packed a cooler with sandwiches, fruit, chips, drinks, and some homemade cookies my girlfriend had baked the night before. Nothing fancy, but enough food for a relaxing afternoon together. We found a perfect spot under a big oak tree, spread out our blanket, and started unpacking our lunch. The park wasn't too crowded, just a few families with kids playing on the playground, and some people walking their dogs. It was exactly the kind of peaceful afternoon we'd been hoping for. About 10 minutes after we'd settled in, this woman approached our blanket. She was probably in her 30s, wearing workout clothes like she'd been jogging or something. She had this friendly smile that immediately put me on guard because something about it seemed fake. "Hi there," she said, standing right at the edge of our blanket. "I'm Yara. Beautiful day for a picnic, isn't it?" "Oh," my girlfriend and I exchanged glances. We said hello back and agreed that it was a nice day, thinking she was just making casual conversation before moving on. Instead, Yara sat down on our blanket without being invited. "Wow, you guys brought a lot of food," she said, eyeing our cooler. "You brought enough for everyone, right?" I was confused by what she meant by everyone. It was just my girlfriend and me. There was no one else with us, and we certainly hadn't invited anyone to join our picnic. It's just for us, I said politely. We're having a private picnic. Yara laughed like I'd made a joke. Come on, don't be like that. There's plenty here, and sharing is caring, right? Without waiting for a response, she reached over and opened our cooler. Actually opened it and started looking through our food like she was shopping at a grocery store. These sandwiches look amazing, she said, pulling out one of the turkey and Swiss sandwiches my girlfriend had carefully made that morning. I haven't eaten anything since breakfast, and I'm absolutely starving. My girlfriend and I were both too shocked to react immediately. This complete stranger had literally sat down at our picnic and was now helping herself to our food, like we were running some kind of charity buffet. Excuse me, I finally managed to say. That's our food. We brought it for ourselves. Yara unwrapped the sandwich and took a bite. Oh my God, this is delicious. You're such a good cook, she said to my girlfriend. Do you have any mustard? I prefer mustard to mayo. I stood up at this point because I couldn't believe what was happening. You need to stop eating our food and leave our picnic area. Yara looked at me like I'd said something incredibly rude. Wow, that's pretty selfish. You have way more food than two people could possibly eat. And I'm just one person who's hungry. What's the big deal? She continued eating our sandwich while talking, getting crumbs all over our blanket. Then she reached into the cooler again and grabbed a bag of chips. I can't believe how stingy people are these days, she continued. When I was growing up, people shared with their community. If someone was hungry and you had extra food, you'd offer it without thinking twice. My girlfriend finally found her voice. We don't know you, and this is our private picnic. You can't just sit down and eat our food. Yara rolled her eyes. It's a public park. I have just as much right to be here as you do, and you clearly have more food than you need. She was right about it being a public park, but that didn't mean she could claim our personal belongings. I told her that while the park was public, our food was private property, and she needed to stop eating it immediately. Instead of apologizing or leaving, Yara doubled down. She grabbed one of my girlfriend's homemade cookies and started eating that too. These are really good, she said with her mouth full. You should consider selling these. I'd definitely buy them. At this point, I was done being polite. I told Yara that she had exactly 10 seconds to get up and leave our picnic area, or I was calling park security. Fine, be that way, she said, but she didn't get up. Instead, she grabbed a bottle of water from our cooler and stood up slowly, like she was doing us a favour. You know what your problem is, she said, pointing the water bottle at us. You're too materialistic. Food is meant to be shared, not hoarded. I feel sorry for people like you, who can't see the bigger picture. She walked away, still carrying our water bottle, which she'd essentially stolen, along with the sandwich and chips and cookie she'd already consumed. My girlfriend and I sat there, in stunned silence for a few minutes, trying to process what had just happened. We'd been having a perfectly normal picnic when a complete stranger decided our food was communal property. The most frustrating part was how she'd turned it around and made us seem like the bad guys for not wanting to feed a random person who'd invited herself to our private meal. We ended up packing up and leaving shortly after because the whole experience had killed the mood. What should have been a relaxing afternoon together turned into this bizarre confrontation with someone who seemed to think basic social boundaries didn't apply to her. That story's over. Yara really sat down at strangers' picnic, helped herself to their food, and then lectured them about being selfish when they objected. The mental gymnastics required to turn theft into a lesson about community sharing is truly impressive. Some people will reframe any situation to make themselves the hero of their own narrative. Our next story shows what happens when family members think your special day is the perfect opportunity for their own spotlight moment. My cousin demanded I let them propose at my wedding because they thought it would be romantic to hijack my reception. I'm 27 and got married last month to the love of my life. We'd been planning our wedding for over a year, saving money, booking vendors, and making sure every detail was perfect. It was going to be a small ceremony with about 80 guests, mostly family and close friends. My cousin Silas is 29 and has been dating his girlfriend Meredith for about 3 years. They've been talking about getting engaged for a while, but Silas has always been the type to procrastinate on big decisions. He's also always been someone who likes to be the center of attention at family gatherings. About 2 weeks before my wedding, Silas called me with what he described as an amazing idea. He said he'd been thinking about proposing to Meredith and realized that my wedding would be the perfect romantic setting for it. "Think about it," he said, clearly excited about his plan. "Everyone will already be dressed up. There'll be flowers everywhere, professional photography, the whole 9 yards. It'll be like a fairy tale proposal." I was silent for a moment, trying to process what he was suggesting. "You want to propose at my wedding?" "Not during the ceremony," he said quickly. "I'm not crazy, but maybe during the reception, like when people are dancing and having a good time. It would be so romantic, and Meredith loves weddings. She'd be over the moon." I told him that I wasn't comfortable with that idea. My wedding was supposed to be about me and my husband, and having someone else's engagement happen during our reception would take attention away from our celebration. Silas seemed surprised by my response. "But we're family," he said. "I thought you'd be happy to be part of our special moment. Besides, it's not like it would ruin your wedding. It would just add more love and happiness to the day." I explained that we'd spent months planning this event and a lot of money to create our perfect wedding day. Having someone else's major life event happen during our reception would change the entire focus of the celebration. "You're being really selfish about this," Silas said. "A wedding is supposed to be about bringing people together and celebrating love. My proposal would just be more celebration." I stood firm and told him absolutely not. If he wanted to propose to Meredith, he needed to plan his own special moment, not hijack mine. Silas got frustrated and said I was being bridezilla about the whole thing. He claimed that family should support each other and that I was prioritizing my perfect day over his happiness. The conversation ended badly, with Silas saying he'd think of something else, but clearly being upset about my refusal to let him use my wedding as his proposal venue. I thought that was the end of it, but I was wrong. On the day of my wedding, everything was going perfectly. The ceremony was beautiful, pictures were amazing, and the reception was in full swing. Guests were eating dinner, the band was playing, and everyone seemed to be having a wonderful time. Then, during a quiet moment between songs, Silas suddenly stood up and started tapping his glass with a fork to get everyone's attention. My heart sank because I immediately knew what was about to happen. "Excuse me, everyone," Silas announced to the room. "I know this is supposed to be about celebrating the happy couple, but I have something special I'd like to share." I tried to catch his eye and shake my head, but he was already pulling Meredith to her feet. She looked confused and a little embarrassed by the sudden attention. "Meredith," Silas said loudly so everyone could hear, "we've been together for 3 years, and being here tonight, surrounded by all this love and family, I realized there's no better time to ask you the most important question of my life." He got down on one knee right there in the middle of my wedding reception and pulled out a ring box. The entire room went silent, and all eyes turned to them instead of me and my husband on what was supposed to be our day. Meredith looked mortified. She kept glancing around the room, clearly aware that she was now the center of attention at someone else's wedding. When she saw me, I could tell she felt terrible about the situation. "Will you marry me?" Silas asked, holding up the ring. Meredith whispered, "Yes," but she looked more embarrassed than excited. The room erupted in applause, but it was that awkward kind of clapping where people aren't sure if they should be celebrating or not. Several guests came up to congratulate Silas and Meredith, which meant they were surrounded by people who should have been focusing on me and my husband. Our photographer started taking pictures of their engagement, using time we'd paid for to capture our wedding. I was furious but tried to keep it together because I didn't want to cause a scene at my own wedding. My husband was equally upset, but we both decided to deal with it later rather than ruin the rest of our reception. The rest of the evening felt split between our wedding celebration and Silas's impromptu engagement party. People kept talking about how romantic it was that they got engaged at a wedding, how it was like getting 2 celebrations for the price of one. My mother-in-law came up to me and said, Well, that was unexpected. I guess everyone will remember this wedding. The way she said it made it clear that they'd remember it for Silas's proposal, not for my marriage. After the reception, I confronted Silas about what he'd done. He acted like I was overreacting and said everyone had a great time. He claimed that his proposal had added excitement to the evening and that I should be happy for them. "You told me I couldn't propose at your wedding," he said, "but then I realised that you can't actually stop me from proposing wherever I want. It's a free country." I told him that what he'd done was incredibly disrespectful and selfish. He'd hijacked our wedding reception and made our special day about him instead. "You're just mad because you weren't the only one getting attention," he said. "But weddings are about love, and now there's more love to celebrate. You should be thanking me for making your wedding more memorable." Meredith later apologised to me privately. She said she had no idea Silas was planning to propose and that she felt terrible about how it had played out. She said if she'd known, she would have stopped him. "I should have said no when he asked," she told me. "Not because I don't want to marry him, but because your wedding wasn't the right time or place. I'm so sorry." Looking back on my wedding day, the thing I remember most isn't my vows or our first dance or cutting the cake. It's the moment my cousin decided to propose to his girlfriend during our reception. Instead of it being purely about my husband and me starting our life together, it became the wedding where Silas got engaged. That story is over. Silas literally hijacked someone's wedding reception for his own proposal and then acted like he was doing them a favour by adding more love to their special day. The fact that he admitted he knew he wasn't supposed to do it but did it anyway shows this was calculated selfishness, not a spontaneous romantic gesture. Poor Meredith got caught in the middle of his attention-seeking scheme. Moving on to our next encounter, which involves someone who apparently thinks they're qualified to diagnose animal neglect based on a 30-second observation. A stranger tried to take my dog's leash while we were walking because they decided he looked neglected. This happened 3 weeks ago, and I'm still baffled by the sheer audacity of this encounter. I have a 3-year-old rescue dog named Buddy. He's a mixed breed, probably part German Shepherd and part something else, and he's the sweetest, most gentle dog you could imagine. When I adopted him 2 years ago, he was underweight and had some issues with his coat, but with proper care and nutrition, he's thrived and is now perfectly healthy. Buddy does have some scars on his face and legs from whatever happened to him before I adopted him. The vet thinks he might have been in fights with other dogs or possibly mistreated, but those scars are old and don't affect his quality of life at all. He's happy, energetic, and well cared for. Last month I was taking Buddy for our usual evening walk around the neighbourhood. It was a beautiful day, and he was enjoying sniffing around and exploring like he always does. We'd stopped at a small park so he could drink from the water fountain they have for dogs. While Buddy was drinking, this woman approached us. She was probably in her 40s, wearing expensive-looking workout clothes, and she had that concerned expression that immediately put me on alert. "Excuse me," she said, looking down at Buddy. "Is this your dog?" I said yes, wondering where this conversation was going. Buddy finished drinking and came over to sit beside me, his tail wagging because he loves meeting new people. The woman crouched down and started examining Buddy without asking permission. She was looking at his scars, touching his face, and making these disapproving, clicking sounds with her tongue. "These scars look terrible," she said. "How long has he been injured like this?" I explained that Buddy was a rescue dog, and the scars were old injuries from before I adopted him. I told her that he'd been seen by a veterinarian and was perfectly healthy. "That's what they all say," she replied, standing up and crossing her arms. "Do you have proof that he's been to a vet recently?" I was taken aback by the question. I told her I didn't carry Buddy's veterinary records with me on walks, but that he was up to date on all his shots and checkups. "He looks thin," she continued, "even though Buddy's actually at the perfect weight according to his vet, and his coat looks dull. Are you feeding him properly?" I started to get annoyed at this point. I told her that Buddy was well fed and well cared for, and that I didn't appreciate her accusations. "Look," she said, "I can tell when an animal is being neglected. This dog needs proper medical attention and probably a better home." Then she did something that shocked me completely. She reached down and grabbed Buddy's leash, trying to take it from my hand. "I'm going to take him to the animal shelter," she announced. "They'll make sure he gets the care he needs." I held tight to the leash and told her to let go immediately. Buddy seemed confused by the sudden tension and started whining softly. "You can't stop me from helping an abused animal," she said, pulling harder on the leash. "I have a responsibility to report neglect when I see it." I told her that she wasn't taking my dog anywhere, and that if she didn't let go of the leash, I was calling the police. "Call them," she said defiantly. "They'll side with me when they see the condition this poor animal is in." At this point, other people in the park were starting to stare at us. A man jogging nearby stopped and asked if everything was okay. "This woman is trying to steal my dog," I told him. "I'm trying to rescue an abused animal," the woman, who I later learned was named Naomi, said to the jogger. "Look at these scars, look how thin he is." The jogger looked at Buddy, who was sitting calmly beside me, with his tail still wagging. "He looks fine to me," the jogger said. "Maybe you should mind your own business." Naomi got even more agitated. "People like you are the reason animal abuse continues," she said. "Everyone just looks the other way, instead of helping innocent creatures." She was still holding onto Buddy's leash, so I firmly pulled it back and told her this was her last warning before I called the police. "Fine, call them," she said, "but I'm not leaving until someone in authority looks at this dog." So I did call the police. While we waited for them to arrive, Naomi continued lecturing me about proper pet care. She told me that Buddy needed to see a veterinarian immediately, that his scars indicated ongoing abuse, and that I was clearly unfit to care for an animal. She also started taking pictures of Buddy with her phone, saying she was documenting evidence of neglect. Every time I tried to move away from her, she followed us, still taking photos. When the police officer arrived, Naomi immediately launched into her story about finding an abused dog and trying to rescue it from a negligent owner. The officer looked at Buddy, who was sitting perfectly calmly and seemed completely unbothered by the whole situation. He asked me for Buddy's vaccination records, which I didn't have with me, but I was able to show him my veterinarian's contact information on my phone. "Ma'am," the officer said to Naomi, "this dog appears to be healthy and well cared for. The owner has provided proof of veterinary care, and the animal shows no signs of current abuse or neglect." Naomi argued with the officer, insisting that the scars were evidence of ongoing mistreatment. The officer explained that old injuries on rescue animals were common and not indicative of current abuse. "You're all just going to let this continue," Naomi said, finally letting go of Buddy's leash. "This dog deserves better than this." The officer warned her about interfering with other people's property and told her that attempting to take someone's dog could be considered theft. After Naomi finally left, the officer stayed to chat with me for a few minutes. He said they get calls like this occasionally from well-meaning people who don't understand the difference between old injuries and current abuse. "Your dog looks happy and healthy," he told me. "Some people just can't mind their own business." The whole encounter lasted about an hour and completely ruined what should have been a peaceful walk. Buddy seemed fine throughout the whole thing, but I was shaken by how quickly the situation had escalated. That story is over. Naomi really tried to physically steal someone's dog based on old scars from before the current owner even adopted him. The fact that she grabbed the leash and announced she was taking him to a shelter shows this wasn't concern, it was vigilante behaviour. Some people are so convinced they're heroes that they'll literally try to steal pets from loving homes. Now let's talk about neighbours who think your property is actually community property, starting with someone who decided to install sports equipment on someone else's house. My neighbour installed a basketball hoop in my driveway without asking and claimed it was community property when I told him to remove it. I'm 30 years old and I live in a suburb where most of the houses have decent-sized driveways and small front yards. I've been in my house for about 2 years and I generally get along well with my neighbours. We wave when we see each other, help with packages when someone's out of town, that sort of thing. My next-door neighbour, Theo, has 2 teenage boys who are really into sports. I see them outside playing football, soccer, basketball, whatever the season calls for. They're good kids, polite when they see me, and they've never caused any problems. About a month ago, I came home from work to find Theo in my driveway with a power drill. He was mounting a basketball hoop to the side of my garage, drilling directly into the wall without any kind of permission or even a heads up that he was planning to do this. I got out of my car and asked him what he was doing. He looked up from his drilling and smiled like this was the most normal thing in the world. "Hey there," he said cheerfully. "I'm putting up a basketball hoop for the boys. This spot has the perfect angle for shooting hoops." I looked around confused. "But this is my garage. You're drilling into my property." Theo waved his hand dismissively. "It's not a big deal. The boys need somewhere to practice, and this is the best location in the whole neighbourhood. Your driveway has the right amount of space and the perfect setup." I told him that he couldn't just install things on my property without asking. He needed to remove whatever he'd already mounted and find somewhere else for his basketball hoop. "Come on, don't be like that," Theo said, continuing to drill. "It's just a basketball hoop. The kids will love it, and you can use it too if you want. Think of it as a community amenity." I was amazed that he was still drilling while I was telling him to stop. I told him more firmly that he needed to stop immediately and remove whatever he'd already installed. "Look," Theo said, finally stopping his drill. "I've already got half the mounting bracket up. It would be wasteful to take it down now. Besides, the boys have been looking forward to this all week." I asked him why he hadn't put the basketball hoop in his own driveway or backyard. Theo explained that his driveway was too narrow and his backyard had too many trees. My property had the ideal setup for basketball. "That's not my problem," I told him. "You can't just decide that my property works better for your needs and start drilling into my garage." Theo seemed genuinely confused by my objection. "It's not like I'm hurting anything. It's just a basketball hoop. Neighbours should help each other out." I told him that helping each other out was one thing, but permanently mounting sports equipment to someone else's house was completely different. He needed to take down whatever he'd installed and find another solution. "Fine," Theo said, but he didn't start removing anything. Instead, he packed up his tools and said he'd finish the installation later. I told him there would be no finishing the installation, that he needed to remove what was already there. Theo said we'd talk about it later and went back to his house. When I examined my garage wall, I could see that he'd already drilled several holes and had mounted part of the bracket system. It wasn't something that could be easily undone without leaving permanent damage to my garage. That evening, I went over to Theo's house to discuss the situation. His wife answered the door and seemed surprised when I explained what had happened. "Theo told me he was putting up a basketball hoop," she said, "but I thought it was going in our backyard." When Theo came to the door, I again told him that he needed to remove the basketball hoop equipment from my garage. He said he'd think about it, but that it seemed like a waste since he'd already started the project. "The boys are really excited about having a place to play basketball," he said, "and it's not like you use that wall for anything." I explained that whether or not I used that wall wasn't the point. It was my property, and he couldn't install things on it without permission. "You're making this way more complicated than it needs to be," Theo said. "It's just a basketball hoop. The whole neighbourhood could use it." Over the next few days, I noticed that Theo had continued working on the installation. Every time I came home, there was more of the basketball hoop system mounted to my garage. He was apparently doing the work while I was at my job. When I confronted him about continuing the installation, after I'd told him to stop, Theo said he was almost finished, and it would be silly to quit now. "Look how great this is going to be," he said, gesturing to the nearly complete basketball hoop. "The boys can practice right here, and you won't have to worry about basketballs in your backyard anymore." I told him I'd never been worried about basketballs in my backyard, because basketball wasn't my problem to solve. His kids could play at the school courts or find some other location. "Those courts are always crowded," Theo said, "and this is So much more convenient. It's basically like having a private court right here. A private court that he'd built on my property without my consent. I told him he had until the weekend to remove everything, or I'd be calling the city to file a complaint. That seems extreme, Theo said. Why don't you just try it out first? I bet once you see how nice it is, you'll change your mind. That weekend I woke up to the sound of basketballs bouncing in my driveway. Theo's boys were out there playing, using the hoop their dad had installed on my garage. When I went outside, Theo was sitting on his porch watching them play like everything was perfectly normal. See how much fun they're having? He called over to me. This was such a great idea. I told the boys they couldn't play basketball in my driveway and that they needed to find somewhere else to play. They seemed confused and looked to their dad for guidance. Theo came over and said I was being unreasonable. They're just kids having fun. What's the harm? I explained once again that the basketball hoop was installed on my property without permission and that I wanted it removed immediately. Fine, Theo said, clearly frustrated, but I'm not paying to fix the holes in your garage wall. If you want me to take it down, you'll have to deal with the damage yourself. I told him that he was responsible for any damage caused by his unauthorized installation. If there were holes to repair, that was his responsibility, not mine. That's not how this works, Theo said. If you want me to undo something I've already done, you have to accept the consequences. I ended up calling the city's code enforcement office. They confirmed that installing anything permanently attached to someone else's property without permission was a violation, and that Theo would need to remove it and repair any damage. The code enforcement officer came out the following week and ordered Theo to remove the basketball hoop within 10 days. He also had to fill and paint over the holes he'd drilled in my garage wall. Theo was furious about having to undo his project. He kept muttering about how neighbourhoods used to be friendlier and how people used to help each other out, instead of calling the authorities over every little thing. It's just a basketball hoop, he said, while removing the mounting brackets. I can't believe you made such a big deal about this. The relationship with Theo has been pretty cold since then. His kids still play basketball, but now they have to go to the school courts or other public areas like every other family in the neighbourhood. That story's over. Theo literally drilled into someone else's garage wall and called it community property when confronted about his unauthorized construction project. The fact that he continued the installation after being told to stop shows he never intended to respect basic property boundaries. Some people think being neighbourly means other people's homes become extensions of their own property. Our next story takes us into the realm of photography, where one person learned that some strangers think professional photo sessions are open invitations for them to join in. A stranger tried to join my family photo session and refused to move because she liked the background. Last month, my family hired a professional photographer for some updated family portraits. We'd been planning this session for weeks, coordinating schedules, picking outfits, and scouting locations. We settled on this beautiful park with a gazebo and flower gardens that would make the perfect backdrop. The photographer, Michelle, arrived right on time and started setting up her equipment. We have 4 kids ranging from ages 6 to 16, so getting everyone positioned and looking decent for photos is always a challenge. Michelle was great with the kids and had this whole system for keeping their attention and getting genuine smiles. We'd been shooting for maybe 20 minutes when this woman appeared. She was probably in her late 20s, wearing a bright yellow sundress, and she just walked right into the area where we were taking pictures. At first, I thought maybe she was just passing through and would keep walking, but instead, she stopped right behind where my family was positioned and started posing for our photographer. Michelle stopped taking pictures and politely told the woman that we were in the middle of a private photo session. The woman, who later told us her name was Delia, smiled and said she knew, but that she loved the lighting and the background and wanted to get some pictures too. "This is such a gorgeous spot," Delia said, adjusting her hair and striking different poses. "I've been looking everywhere for a place like this for my own photos." I explained that we had hired a photographer and booked this location for our family portraits. This was a scheduled session, not a general photo opportunity. "Oh, I don't mind sharing," Delia said cheerfully. "There's plenty of room for all of us. Your photographer can just take pictures of me too while she's here." Michelle tried to explain that she was hired specifically to photograph our family and couldn't take pictures of random strangers. Delia seemed confused by this explanation. "But you're already here with all your equipment set up," she said. "It would only take a few minutes to get some shots of me. I can even pay you something if that's what this is about." I told Delia that this wasn't about money. It was about the fact that we'd scheduled and paid for this time and location for our family photos. She needed to find somewhere else to take her pictures. "That seems really selfish," Delia said, but she didn't move. "This is a public park. I have just as much right to be here as you do." She was technically correct about it being a public park, but that didn't give her the right to insert herself into our private photography session. I told her that while she could be in the park, she couldn't be in our photos. "I'm not hurting anything," she insisted. "I'm just standing here. If you don't want me in your pictures, your photographer can just crop me out later." Michelle, bless her heart, tried to continue working around Delia. She repositioned our family to different angles, but Delia kept moving too, staying in the frame no matter where we went. "This light is just perfect right here," Delia kept saying. "I never find lighting this good." My husband finally lost his patience and told Delia directly that she needed to leave our photo area immediately. We were paying for a professional service, and she was interfering with it. "You don't own this gazebo," Delia replied, "and I was here first anyway." This was completely untrue. We'd been set up and taking pictures for over 20 minutes before she appeared. But Delia insisted she'd been in the area first, just waiting for the right moment to take her own photos. "I've been planning to take pictures here all morning," she claimed. "You just happened to set up your big production in my spot." Michelle suggested we move to a different location in the park, but I was frustrated that we had to accommodate someone who was clearly being unreasonable. We'd specifically chosen this spot for the beautiful gazebo and garden backdrop. "See? Problem solved," Delia said, when she heard about us potentially moving. "Now I can have the gazebo area, and you can find somewhere else just as nice." But she didn't stay put when we started to move our equipment. She followed us to the next location, a small bridge over a pond, and immediately started posing there too. "Oh wow, this is even better," she said, leaning against the bridge railing. "The water reflection is going to look amazing in photos." At this point, my kids were getting restless and confused about why this strange woman kept appearing in their pictures. My youngest daughter asked why the lady in the yellow dress was in all our family photos. I decided to call park security, but the park didn't have dedicated security staff. The woman at the information booth said they could send someone from maintenance, but it might take a while. Michelle, who had been incredibly professional through this whole ordeal, finally addressed Delia directly. "Mom, I understand you want to take photos, but this family has hired me for a specific time slot. You're disrupting their session, which they've paid for. I'm going to need you to step back and wait until we're finished." "Fine," Delia said, but she only moved about 10 feet away. She stood there watching our entire session, occasionally calling out suggestions for poses or commenting on how she would have done things differently. "You should try having everyone look in different directions," she'd say. Or, "That pose would look better if you moved closer together." It was like having an unwanted photography critic hovering over our family session. Michelle did her best to ignore the commentary and focus on getting the shots we needed. Near the end of our session, Delia approached Michelle and asked if she could hire her for a quick mini-session right there. She offered to pay cash for just 15 minutes of photography. Michelle politely declined and explained that she had other appointments to get to. Delia seemed genuinely surprised that she couldn't just extend our session to include her own photos. "But you're already here," she kept saying, "and I already know I like how you work from watching you with them." When we were packing up to leave, Delia asked if she could get Michelle's contact information for future photo sessions. Michelle gave her a business card, but mentioned that her sessions required advance booking and planning. "That seems unnecessarily complicated," Delia said. "I like to be more spontaneous with my photography." Looking back at the photos Michelle took that day, You can actually see Delia in the background of several shots. She's not the main focus, but she's definitely there, posing and trying to get into our family pictures. We ended up having to pay Michelle for extra time because the session ran longer due to all the interruptions and location changes. What should have been a smooth, enjoyable family photo experience turned into this bizarre encounter with someone who couldn't understand basic social boundaries. That story is over. Delia really thought she could crash a paid photography session and then act like the family was being unreasonable for wanting privacy. Following them to multiple locations while offering unsolicited posing advice takes boundary crossing to a whole new level. The mental image of this woman in a yellow dress photobombing an entire family portrait session is both infuriating and absurd. Speaking of people who think they're entitled to other people's belongings, this next story involves a friend who decided to try some sleight of hand with expensive electronics. My friend tried to swap their broken phone for mine while I wasn't looking and acted confused when I caught them. I've been friends with Hank for about 5 years now. We met in college and stayed close after graduation. He's always been the type of person who's a little too comfortable borrowing things and not great about returning them, but I never thought he'd try something like this. A few weeks ago, Hank and I met up for lunch at this casual restaurant near my apartment. We do this pretty regularly, just catching up and hanging out. I'd just gotten a new phone the week before, one of those expensive flagship models that I'd been saving up for months to buy. Hank had been complaining about his phone for weeks. The screen was completely cracked, the battery died constantly, and half the apps wouldn't work properly. He kept saying he needed to get it fixed or buy a new one, but he never seemed to actually do anything about it. When I showed him my new phone at lunch, he was really impressed with it. He kept asking about the camera quality, how fast it was, what kind of case I was using. I let him hold it and play around with it for a few minutes while we talked. "This is exactly the phone I want to get," he said, turning it over in his hands. "Same model, same colour, everything. It's perfect." We both have the same type of phone case, one of those thick protective ones that are pretty popular. Mine was black, his was black, so they looked basically identical, except for the condition of the phones inside them. After we finished eating, I went to the bathroom while Hank waited at the table. When I came back, we chatted for a few more minutes, and then got ready to leave. I grabbed what I thought was my phone from the table, and we headed out. It wasn't until I got home about an hour later that I realised something was wrong. I pulled out my phone to check messages, and immediately noticed that the screen was cracked. Not just cracked, but completely spiderwebbed with damage that definitely wasn't there when I'd left for lunch. My first thought was that I must have dropped it somehow without noticing, but that didn't make sense. The phone had been fine at the restaurant, and I'd been careful with it like I always am with new electronics. Then I looked more closely at the phone and realised it wasn't even mine. The wallpaper was different. There were apps I'd never downloaded, and when I checked the settings, it was registered to Hank's name. Hank had somehow switched our phones while I was in the bathroom. He'd taken my brand new phone and left me with his broken one in the identical case. I called him immediately, using his old phone that I now apparently owned. "Hey, what's up?" he answered, sounding completely normal. I told him that he had my phone and I had his, that somehow our phones had gotten switched at the restaurant. "What? That's weird," Hank said, but something in his voice sounded off. "How did that happen?" I told him I had no idea, but that we needed to meet up and switch them back as soon as possible. "Yeah, of course, Hotai," he said. "I'm actually pretty busy tonight, but maybe tomorrow?" I told him this couldn't wait until tomorrow. I needed my phone back immediately, especially since his was barely functional and I had important work calls to take. "I mean, they're basically the same phone," Hank said. "Does it really matter which one you have?" That's when I knew this hadn't been an accident. I told Hank that of course it mattered, that one phone was brand new and the other was completely broken. "Right, but they're the same model," he said. "Same everything except for a little screen damage. You could just get the screen fixed." I was amazed that he was suggesting I should pay to repair his broken phone, instead of just returning my new one. I told him I was coming over to his apartment right now to get my phone back. Okay, don't get all worked up about it, Hank said. I honestly didn't even notice they got switched. I just grabbed what I thought was my phone when we left. When I got to his apartment, Hank acted like this was all just a big misunderstanding. He handed me my phone and took back his broken one, but he seemed annoyed about having to do the exchange. I still don't understand how this happened, he said, even though it was obvious he'd deliberately swapped them. I examined my phone to make sure it was really mine and hadn't been damaged. Everything seemed fine, but I was disturbed by the fact that Hank had apparently planned this whole switch. You know, if you ever want to upgrade your phone, I'd be happy to take this one off your hands, Hank said as I was leaving. We could work out some kind of payment plan or trade situation. I told him I wasn't interested in any trades and that I was disappointed he'd tried to keep my phone. I wasn't trying to keep it, he insisted. It was just a mix-up. But since we both have the same case and everything, maybe we should be more careful in the future. The whole thing felt so calculated. The way he'd waited until I went to the bathroom. How he'd tried to convince me that the phones were basically the same. The suggestion that I should just get his screen repaired. It wasn't a mistake or accident. Since then, I've been much more careful about my belongings when I'm around Hank. I don't let him handle my phone or other expensive items, and I make sure to keep track of my stuff when we're together. The friendship has definitely changed since this incident. I can't look at him the same way, knowing that he was willing to try to steal my new phone and then lie about it being an accident. A few days later, Hank texted me, asking if I was sure I had the right phone, saying his seemed different somehow. I think he was still hoping to convince me to switch back, but I ignored the message. That story is over. Hank really thought he could pull off the old switcheroo with expensive electronics and then gaslight his friend into thinking it was an accident. The fact that he kept pushing they're basically the same phone angle, while knowing one was broken and one was brand new, shows this was pure calculated theft. Some people will torpedo years of friendship over a few $100s worth of smartphone. Now let's dive into another story about someone who thought public spaces meant they could help themselves to whatever they wanted, including other people's private celebrations. A stranger crashed my family barbecue and claimed they were invited by someone who doesn't exist. This happened over Labor Day weekend, and I'm still trying to understand the thought process behind what this person did. My family has this annual tradition where we host a big barbecue in our backyard for Labor Day. We invite about 30 people, mostly relatives and close family friends. It's always been a really nice way to end the summer, and everyone looks forward to it. This year, I spent the whole morning setting up tables, stringing lights, and preparing food. My wife was inside making side dishes, and our kids were helping arrange chairs. We'd been planning this for weeks, coordinating with everyone about what they were bringing and making sure we had enough space for everyone. Around 2 in the afternoon, people started arriving. The usual crowd of aunts, uncles, cousins, and neighbours we'd known for years. Everyone was having a great time, catching up and enjoying the food. About an hour into the party, this guy I'd never seen before walked into our backyard carrying a folding chair and a cooler. He was probably in his 30s, wearing a Hawaiian shirt and flip-flops, looking like he was ready for a beach vacation. He set up his chair right in the middle of our patio area and started unpacking his cooler like he belonged there. I walked over and politely asked who he was and how he knew our family. "Oh, I'm Miguel," he said with a big smile. "Thanks so much for inviting me. This looks like an awesome party." I told him I didn't remember inviting anyone named Miguel and asked which family member had told him about the barbecue. "It was your cousin Carmen," he said confidently. "She said you guys throw the best Labor Day parties in the neighbourhood." The problem was, I don't have a cousin named Carmen. I told Miguel this and asked if maybe he had the wrong address or was thinking of a different family. No, this is definitely the right place," he said, gesturing around the yard. Carmen described it perfectly. The blue house with the big oak tree and the red fence. Our house is blue, and we do have an oak tree, but our fence is white, not red. I told Miguel I thought there might be some confusion and that he might be looking for a different barbecue. Carmen specifically said to look for the guy in the red polo shirt, Miguel said, pointing at me. I was wearing a red polo shirt, but that seemed like a pretty generic description that could apply to lots of people at lots of barbecues. I told Miguel that I was certain I didn't know anyone named Carmen, and that this was a private family gathering. Maybe you just forgot you invited me, he suggested. Carmen said she talked to you about it last week. At this point, my wife came over to see what was going on. I explained the situation, and she confirmed that we didn't know anyone named Carmen and hadn't invited anyone named Miguel. There must be some misunderstanding, Miguel said, but he didn't seem concerned about it. But I'm already here and I brought potato salad. Can't I just stay for a little while? He opened his cooler and pulled out a store-bought container of potato salad. Like this proved he belonged at our family barbecue. My wife told him politely that while we appreciated the gesture, this was a private event for family and close friends, and he'd need to find the right party he was supposed to attend. But I drove all the way across town, Miguel said, and Carmen really talked this up. She said your burgers are legendary. I told him I was sorry he'd made the trip, but that he definitely had the wrong barbecue. I offered to help him figure out where he was supposed to go, maybe by calling this Carmen person. I don't have her number, Miguel admitted. I met her at the grocery store checkout line, and she just told me about the party. This story was getting stranger by the minute. Miguel had apparently been invited to a barbecue by a random person he'd met at the grocery store, who'd given him our address for reasons I couldn't understand. Look, Miguel said, I can see you're confused about this, but I'm sure Carmen cleared it with you. Maybe she talked to your wife instead. My wife shook her head and said she'd never spoken to anyone named Carmen about inviting strangers to our barbecue. Well, I'm here now, Miguel said, settling back into his folding chair, and I promise I'll be the perfect guest. I won't eat too much or stay too late. Several of our actual guests were starting to stare at this conversation. My brother-in-law came over and asked if everything was okay. I explained that Miguel claimed he'd been invited by someone named Carmen, who didn't exist, and that we were trying to figure out where he was actually supposed to be. Maybe Carmen is someone's nickname, Miguel suggested. Like, maybe your sister goes by Carmen sometimes? I told him that none of my family members went by Carmen, and that we'd established this wasn't where he was supposed to be. But your burgers smell amazing, Miguel said, looking toward the grill where my dad was cooking. And everyone seems so nice. Are you sure I can't just hang out for a bit? At this point, I was getting frustrated. I told Miguel clearly that he needed to leave our property and find the correct barbecue he was supposed to attend. That seems really unfriendly, Miguel said. Carmen told me you guys were super welcoming to everyone. I told him that we were welcoming to people we'd actually invited, but that he was crashing a private family event based on directions from a mysterious person who talked to him in a grocery store line. Fine, Miguel said, but he didn't get up from his chair. But can I at least finish this beer? I just opened it. He pulled a beer out of his cooler, popped it open, and took a long drink like he was settling in for the afternoon. My dad came over at this point and asked what was going on. When I explained the situation, he told Miguel directly that he needed to pack up and leave immediately. I get it, Miguel said, but he was still drinking his beer and not moving. Just let me finish this and I'll be out of your hair. My dad told him he could finish his beer somewhere else, and that he had 60 seconds to gather his things and leave our property. Miguel finally stood up, but he moved very slowly, folding his chair and packing his cooler like he was trying to stretch out the process as long as possible. This is really disappointing, he said, as he gathered his things. Carmen made this sound like such a fun, inclusive gathering. As he was leaving, Miguel turned back and said, "If you see Carmen, tell her the potato salad thing didn't work out." We never figured out who Carmen was or why someone would give a stranger our address for a family barbecue. Miguel just vanished into the neighborhood, presumably to crash someone else's Labor Day celebration. That story is over. The fact that Miguel created an entire fictional person to justify crashing a family barbecue and then acted disappointed when reality didn't match his fantasy is genuinely impressive. Some people will construct elaborate backstories rather than admit they're just looking for free food and entertainment. Our next story involves someone who thought expensive restaurants operate on an honor system when it comes to paying the bill. A couple tried to dine and dash from an upscale restaurant and blamed me for not covering their meal when they got caught. I work as a server at a fairly expensive steakhouse downtown. It's the kind of place where entrees start at $30, and a bottle of wine can cost more than most people spend on groceries in a week. Last Saturday night, I had this couple seated in my section. They seemed normal enough when they first arrived, maybe in their late 20s, dressed nicely enough to fit in with our usual clientele. The woman, who I'll call Rachel, was wearing what looked like designer clothes, and her boyfriend Troy had on an expensive-looking watch. They ordered cocktails to start, then appetizers, then expensive steaks with all the sides. They also ordered a bottle of wine that cost $80. Throughout the meal, they were polite and seemed to be enjoying everything. Rachel kept complimenting the food and asking detailed questions about ingredients and preparation methods. Troy was taking pictures of his steak and talking about how this was exactly the kind of place he'd been wanting to try. They seemed like the kind of customers who were going to tip well and maybe become regulars. I gave them attentive service, made sure their drinks were always full, and checked on them regularly without being intrusive. When they finished their meal, I brought them the check. Their total was just over $200, which was pretty typical for what they'd ordered. Rachel looked at the check and said, "Oh wow, we should probably ask for separate checks. Can you split this up for us?" I told her I could definitely do that, and asked how they wanted it divided. She said she'd take the appetizers and her steak, and Troy would take his steak and the wine. I went back to the computer and split their check. Rachel's portion came to about $75, and Troy's was around $130. I brought them the separate checks, and they both looked them over carefully. Rachel pulled out her credit card and handed it to me with her check. "I'll be right back with this," I told her, and headed to the payment terminal. When I returned with Rachel's card and receipt, Troy was nowhere to be seen. Rachel said he'd gone to the bathroom and would be right back. She signed her receipt and left a decent tip, then sat back in her chair to wait for Troy. We chatted for a few minutes about the restaurant and the neighborhood. After about 10 minutes, Rachel started looking around for Troy. "He's been in there a while," she said, glancing toward the restrooms. I suggested she might want to check on him, since we'd need to close out his check soon. Rachel walked toward the back of the restaurant, where the restrooms were located. A few minutes later, she came back looking confused and slightly panicked. "He's not in the bathroom," she said. "I checked both of them, and he's not there." I looked around the restaurant, but Troy was definitely gone. His check was still sitting on the table, unsigned and unpaid. "Maybe he went outside to take a phone call," I suggested, though I was starting to get a sinking feeling about what was happening. Rachel pulled out her phone and tried calling Troy. It went straight to voicemail. "I can't believe this," she said, looking genuinely distressed. "He just left me here." I told her that unfortunately, someone would need to pay Troy's portion of the bill. The restaurant couldn't just absorb the cost because one person in a party decided to leave. "But I already paid my part," Rachel said. "I can't pay for his food too. I don't have that much money on me." I explained that typically, when people dine together, they're jointly responsible for the entire bill unless they've made other arrangements in advance. "That's not fair," Rachel said, her voice getting louder. "He ordered that expensive wine without even asking me. Why should I have to pay for something I didn't drink?" Several other diners were starting to look in our direction. I suggested we speak with my manager to see what options we had. When my manager came over, Rachel explained that her boyfriend had abandoned her with part of the check. She kept emphasizing that she'd already paid her portion and shouldn't be responsible for his. My manager, who's dealt with situations like this before, told Rachel that unfortunately, the restaurant still needed the full amount for the meal they'd both consumed. "Can't you just comp his portion?" Rachel asked. "I mean, I'm a victim here too. He screwed both of us over." My manager explained that the restaurant couldn't absorb the cost of someone dining and dashing, and that we'd need to either collect payment or contact the authorities. "This is ridiculous," Rachel said, her voice getting even louder. "You're treating me like I'm the criminal here." She pulled out her phone and tried calling Troy again, but it still went straight to voicemail. "Look," she said to my manager, "I'll give you his phone number and you can go after him for the money, but I'm not paying for food I didn't eat." My manager told her that we'd need payment tonight and that tracking down her boyfriend later wasn't really an option. That's when Rachel turned to me and said something that absolutely floored me. "Can't you just cover it?" she asked. "You made good tips tonight, right? It's only like $100. I stared at her, not believing what I'd just heard. She was asking me, the server, to pay for her boyfriend's meal out of my own pocket. "I can't pay for customers' meals," I told her. "That's not how restaurants work." "But you're the one who served us," Rachel said, as if this logic made perfect sense. "If you hadn't been so pushy about the wine, maybe the check wouldn't be so high." I had never been pushy about wine. Troy had specifically asked for recommendations and chosen the bottle himself after looking at the wine list. My manager stepped in at this point and told Rachel that she had two options. She could pay the remaining balance, or we could call the police and report it as theft of services. "Fine, call the police," Rachel said defiantly. "They'll see that I'm the victim here." So we did call the police. While we waited for them to arrive, Rachel sat at the table complaining loudly about how unfair the situation was. "This is exactly why I hate expensive restaurants," she announced to anyone who would listen. "They trap you with these huge bills and then act like it's your fault when you can't pay." When the police arrived, they listened to both sides of the story. The officer explained to Rachel that when people dine together, they're typically considered jointly responsible for the bill. "But I didn't know he was going to leave," Rachel protested. "If I'd known that, I would never have agreed to split the check." The officer told her that intent didn't really matter. She'd consumed food and beverages worth over $200, and the restaurant needed to be paid for what was consumed. Rachel finally agreed to put the remaining balance on her credit card, but she was furious about it. She kept muttering about how she was going to dispute the charge and never come back to the restaurant. As she was leaving, she turned to me one more time and said, "I hope you're happy. You probably cost me my relationship over a stupid bill." I watched her walk out, still amazed that she'd tried to make me pay for her boyfriend's meal, and then blamed the entire situation on the restaurant staff. The whole incident took almost an hour to resolve, during which time I couldn't take care of my other tables properly. It was one of the most bizarre dining and dash attempts I'd ever witnessed. That story is over. Rachel really tried to make her server personally pay for her boyfriend's abandoned meal, and then acted like she was the victim in a dining and dash scheme. The mental gymnastics required to turn planned theft into everyone else's problem is truly remarkable. Speaking of people who think their problems become everyone else's responsibility, this next story involves someone who decided a stranger's car was the perfect solution to their transportation crisis. A stranger got into my car at a gas station and refused to get out because they needed a ride more than I did. This happened 2 weeks ago, and I'm still processing how bold some people can be when they're desperate. I was stopping for gas on my way home from work, just a routine fill-up at a station I've used dozens of times before. It was around 6 in the evening, still plenty of daylight, and there were other people around, so I felt completely safe. I'd finished pumping gas and was about to get back in my car when this woman approached me. She was probably in her 40s, carrying a large purse and what looked like a grocery bag full of stuff. "Excuse me," she said, "are you heading toward downtown?" I told her I was actually going in the opposite direction, toward the suburbs where I live. "Oh," she said, looking disappointed. "What about the mall? Are you going anywhere near the mall?" I told her that I wasn't going to the mall either, that I was heading straight home after work. She said, like she was trying to figure out how my plans could be adjusted to help her. "Where exactly are you going? Maybe it's on the way to where I need to be." I told her I was going to my house, which was about 15 minutes away in a residential neighbourhood. She asked what neighbourhood, and when I told her, she said that was actually perfect. "I know someone who lives near there," she said. even though she'd just been asking about completely different destinations. "Could you give me a ride?" I politely declined and said I didn't give rides to strangers. She seemed surprised by this response. "But you're going that way anyway," she said. "It's not like I'm asking you to go out of your way." I told her that regardless of which direction I was heading, I wasn't comfortable giving rides to people I didn't know. "Come on, don't be like that," she said. "I'm obviously harmless. I'm just a middle-aged woman who needs to get somewhere." I suggested she call a rideshare app or a taxi if she needed transportation. "Those apps are so expensive," she complained, "and I've been waiting for a bus for over an hour. The public transportation in this city is terrible." I sympathised with her transportation problems, but told her I still couldn't help her. That's when she did something that completely shocked me. While I was standing there talking to her, she opened the passenger door of my car and got in. "Look," she said from inside my car, "I really need to get to this address, and you're my best option right now." I told her she needed to get out of my car immediately. She shook her head and said she just needed a quick ride. "I promise I'm not crazy or dangerous," she said, buckling her seatbelt. "I just really need your help." I stood outside my own car, holding the driver's door open, trying to figure out how to handle this situation. This woman had literally climbed into my vehicle without permission and was now refusing to get out. "Ma'am, you need to exit my car right now," I said firmly. "This is not okay." "Just hear me out," she said. "My car broke down this morning, and I've been trying to get around all day using buses and asking for help. I have to pick up my prescription before the pharmacy closes, and then I need to get home to let my dog out." I told her that while I understood she was having a difficult day, that didn't give her the right to get into my car without permission. "But you could solve all my problems in like 20 minutes, she said. "And it would be such a good deed. Don't you want to help someone who's struggling?" I told her that helping someone and being forced to help someone were two very different things, and that she was currently forcing the situation. "I'm not forcing anything," she said. "I'm just sitting here hoping you'll be a good Samaritan." A good Samaritan who happened to have a stranger climb, uninvited, into their car. I told her one more time to get out, and that if she didn't, I'd call the police. "That seems extreme," she said. "Can't we just work this out between us? I'll even pay you for gas." She pulled a crumpled $5 bill out of her purse and held it up like this was a reasonable payment for forcing someone to become her personal driver. I pulled out my phone and started dialing 911. That's when she finally started to take the situation seriously. Okay, don't call the cops," she said, unbuckling her seatbelt. "But I really don't understand why you're being so difficult about this." She gathered her purse and grocery bag and got out of my car, but she didn't leave the area. "You know, this is exactly what's wrong with society," she said, standing next to my car while I got into the driver's seat. "Nobody wants to help anybody anymore." I locked my doors and started the engine, hoping she would take the hint and move away from my vehicle. Instead, she knocked on my window. "Are you sure you won't reconsider?" she asked through the glass. "I could really use your help, and it would mean so much to me." I shook my head and put the car in drive. She finally stepped back and let me leave, but I could see her in my rearview mirror, still standing in the same spot as I drove away. The whole encounter lasted maybe 10 minutes, but it felt much longer. I couldn't believe someone had actually climbed into my car and then tried to negotiate staying there. I drove straight home, checking my mirrors to make sure she hadn't somehow followed me. For the rest of the evening, I kept thinking about how bold she'd been and wondering what would have happened if I hadn't been firm about making her leave. That story is over. The woman really climbed into a stranger's car, buckled her seatbelt, and then tried to negotiate a rideshare arrangement, like this was a normal way to solve transportation problems. Offering $5 as payment for what was essentially carjacking shows a stunning disconnect from reality. Our final story tonight involves someone who thought an expensive restaurant was actually running a charity buffet service. A woman brought her entire extended family to eat at the restaurant where I work, and expected everything to be free because it was someone's birthday. I've been working as a server at this upscale Italian restaurant for about 3 years now. We're not the fanciest place in town, but our entrees range from $25 to $40, and most people understand they're paying for a nice dining experience. Last Thursday evening, this group of about 12 people walked in without a reservation. They had balloons, wrapped presents, and were clearly celebrating something special. The woman who seemed to be organising everything, who I'll call Patricia, approached the hostess stand and announced that they were here for a birthday celebration. Our hostess explained that we were pretty busy, and it might be a 30-minute wait for a table that could accommodate their large group. "Oh, we don't mind waiting," Patricia said cheerfully. "It's my mother's 70th birthday, so we want to make sure she has a special evening." While they waited, Patricia kept asking our hostess about our birthday policies. Did we do anything special for birthday celebrations? Did we have a special birthday dessert? Did we sing happy birthday? Our hostess explained that we could certainly bring out a dessert with a candle, and our staff would be happy to sing if the birthday person wanted that kind of attention. "That's perfect," Patricia said. "And what about the birthday discount? How much do you take off for the birthday person's meal?" Our hostess looked confused and told her that we don't have a birthday discount policy. "Really?" Patricia seemed surprised. "Most restaurants give you a free meal on your birthday. Are you sure you don't have anything like that?" Our hostess confirmed that we don't offer free birthday meals, just a complimentary dessert if they wanted it. When their table was ready, I was assigned to serve them. They were a nice enough group, 3 generations of family clearly excited to celebrate Grandma's milestone birthday. Well, there you have it. Thanks for listening to these wild tales from the internet. And remember, if any of these situations sound familiar, you're definitely not alone in wondering what planet some people are from.